In the lawless valley where fear rules, outlaws prey on the weak, except one woman. When ruthless bandits target Catherine Kate Shepherd's cabin, they overlook her fiercest protector, Ranger, her loyal German shepherd with a killer instinct. Now Kate must choose, hide in grief, or let Ranger do what he does best. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special. For you! The autumn wind carried the scent of pine and distant wood smoke across the valley as Catherine Shepherd stood on her porch, surveying the land that stretched before her cabin. At her side, Ranger sat perfectly still, his black and tan coat gleaming. In the late afternoon sun, Ishas perked forward as he processed sounds that human ears could never detect. "What is it, boy?" Catherine murmured, noticing the subtle shift in the dog's posture. Ranger's attention had fixed on the winding dirt road that led through the valley, though nothing was visible to Catherine's eyes. She had learned to trust the animal's instincts implicitly over their years together. At 46, Catherine's face bore the weathered lines of someone who had seen more than her fair share of hardship. Her auburn hair, now streaked with silver, was usually tied back, in a practical braid that hung between her shoulder blades. Today it caught the breeze as she stood motionless, allowing Ranger's senses to guide her awareness. There it was, the distant rumble of an approaching vehicle, still minutes away from view. Catherine's hand instinctively moved to Ranger's head, a light touch that communicated volumes between them. The dog remained statue still, but a nearly imperceptible tremor ran through his powerful frame. "Let's get inside," she said quietly, turning toward the cabin door. "No need to announce ourselves today." The modest cabin that Catherine called home had stood for nearly a century at the edge of Hollow Creek. Built by pioneering hands from the sturdy pine that dominated the valley, it had withstood blizzards, droughts, and the slow march of time that had claimed the original settlement. Downstream, what once had been a thriving mining community had dwindled to scattered homesteads and the small town of Millerville, some 15 miles away. Inside, Catherine moved with practiced efficiency through rooms that reflected both utility and care. Her home was modest, but meticulously organized, a place for everything and everything in its place. Though she lived alone, save for Ranger, there were touches throughout that revealed a life once shared. A pair of rocking chairs on the porch, photographs carefully arranged on the mantel, and a collection of military insignia displayed in a shadow box on the wall. Ranger took his position by the window, his eyes tracking the road, while Catherine put a kettle on the wood stove. The cabin's interior remained cool despite the mid-September warmth outside, the thick log walls providing natural insulation. She added another piece of split pine to the stove, listening to the crackle of the fire and the approaching engine. Sound that grew steadily louder. "Wonder who that could be," she said to Ranger, though she had her suspicions. Visitors to her remote property were rare and seldom coincidental. From a high cupboard, Catherine retrieved a tin of tea and a jar of honey from her own beehives. As she prepared her cup, her movements remained unhurried, but her mind worked. Quickly through possibilities and contingencies, the vehicle outside slowed as it approached her property line, the engine's pitch changing as it navigated the rutted drive that led to her cabin. Ranger's ears flattened slightly, his body tensing, in response to what he could hear or smell, or both. Years of training allowed him to maintain his position without barking, even as the unmistakable sound of car doors opening and closing echoed from outside. Catherine glanced at the clock on her wall. 4:17 p.m. Late enough in the day that any legitimate visitor would know they were imposing on supper time, early enough that they'd still have daylight for the drive back to town. She noted these details automatically, a habit formed through years of careful observation. 3 distinct sets of footsteps approached her porch. Heavy boots, men's voices, one hushed, too confident. The expected knock landed against her door with more force than necessary. "Mrs. Shepherd," a voice called out, attempting cordiality but missing the mark. "Got a minute to talk?" Catherine moved to stand beside Ranger, her hand dropping to rest lightly on his back. She felt the coiled readiness in his muscles, though to a casual observer he appeared merely attentive. "Who's asking?" she called back, her voice carrying the evenness of someone accustomed to unexpected situations. "Name's Ray Thornton. I represent Black Pine Development. We've met before in town." Catherine did indeed remember Ray Thornton, a man with an expensive watch, a practiced smile that never reached his eyes, and a reputation for acquiring properties throughout the valley through means that bordered on coercion. She had declined his previous offers to purchase her land with a politeness that nonetheless made her position clear. "I remember," she replied, making no move toward the door. "What brings you out this far, Mr. Thornton?" A pause followed, perhaps, as Thornton recalibrated his approach. "Got some new information about the highway project that might interest you. Thought it best to discuss it in person." Catherine weighed her options. Turning Thornton away at the door would only delay the inevitable. Better to hear what he had to say and send him on his way with another firm refusal. "One moment," she said, her hand giving Ranger a subtle command signal. The dog immediately shifted position, moving to sit beside the stone hearth where he remained, alert but less visible from the doorway. Catherine opened the door to find Ray Thornton standing on her porch, flanked by two men she didn't recognize. Thornton himself looked much as she remembered, early 50s, expensively dressed for what was supposedly a casual visit to a remote property, with a smile that seemed practiced in front of mirrors. "Mrs. Shepherd," he greeted her with a slight nod. "Appreciate you taking the time." "It's Ms.," Catherine corrected automatically. "I've kept my name but prefer the correct title." If Thornton was embarrassed by the correction, he didn't show it. "Of course, Miss Shepherd. May we come in? The information I have concerns you directly." Catherine held her ground in the doorway. "I'm in the middle of evening chores, Mr. Thornton. Whatever you have to say can be said here." Thornton's smile tightened almost imperceptibly as he glanced at his companions. The man to his right was younger, perhaps early 30s, with the build of someone who relied on physical intimidation. The other man, leaning against the porch railing with affected casualness, had the hard eyes of someone accustomed to getting his way by whatever means necessary. "This is Mike Garrett," Thornton gestured to the younger man, "and Liam Cahill. They're associates helping with community relations for the development project." Catherine nodded but offered no response beyond basic acknowledgement. Her assessment of the two men confirmed what she had already suspected. These weren't corporate representatives, but hired muscle, dressed up in button-down shirts and clean jeans. "The county commissioner approved the final highway route yesterday," Thornton continued, when Catherine didn't invite further conversation. "The new road will cut directly through the eastern portion of the valley, through Sullivan's old place and the Reeves property," Catherine observed. "That's right." Thornton seemed pleased she was following. "Both families have already sold to us, as have the Wilkinsons and Old Man Parker." Catherine was unsurprised. Jacob Sullivan had been talking about moving closer to his daughter in Colorado for years. The Reeves place had stood empty since Martin. Reeves passed last winter, his children having moved away decades ago. As for the others, well, economic pressures had been mounting for many of the valley's remaining residents. "What does this have to do with my property?" Catherine asked, though she already knew the answer. "The highway route is 5 miles from here at its closest point." Thornton shifted his weight forward slightly. "That's why I'm here. The approved route works, but our engineers have identified an alternative that would be more efficient. It would pass through the northern edge of your property, just below the ridgeline." "My answer remains the same as the last 2 times you've asked, Mr. Thornton. My land is not for sale." The man called Cahill made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a snort. Thornton shot him a warning glance before returning his attention. To Catherine, The offer has improved substantially, Ms. Shepherd. In light of the approved route, we're authorized to offer you $300,000, nearly triple the market value for this much land in the valley. The sum was indeed substantial, enough to start a new life anywhere she might choose to go. Catherine knew that many would consider her foolish for refusing. Yet the thought of leaving the home she had built with Daniel, the land where his memory still lived in every corner, was unthinkable. I appreciate the offer, but my position hasn't changed. This land is not for sale at any price. A silence fell across the porch, broken only by the whisper of wind through the pines and the distant call of a hawk circling above the valley. Catherine could sense the tension radiating from the three men, particularly from Cahill, whose casual posture had stiffened at her refusal. "Ms. Shepherd," Thornton began again, his voice dropping to what he likely thought was a reasonable, neighborly tone. "I understand your attachment to the property, but you should know that the highway is coming one way or another. Property values in isolated areas like this will drop once construction begins. The time to sell is now, while the offer is generous." "Is that a threat, Mr. Thornton?" Catherine asked evenly. "Not at all. Just a statement of economic reality." Thornton spread his hands in a gesture of innocence. "We're offering you a way forward that benefits everyone." A soft sound from inside the cabin caught Cahill's attention. His eyes narrowed as he peered past Catherine into the dim interior. "That your dog?" he asked, the first words he'd spoken. Since arriving, Catherine didn't turn around. "Yes, that's Ranger. German Shepherd, right? Used to have one myself." Cahill's interest seemed oddly focused. "Mind if I say hello? I'm good with dogs." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The request was unusual enough to put Catherine further on alert. He's not particularly social with strangers. Cahill pushed off from the railing, taking a half step toward the door. "Military dog, isn't he? Notice the shadow box with the service. Medals inside? Your husband's?" The unexpected reference to Daniel sent a cold shock through Catherine. How had Cahill seen the shadow box from the doorway? Had they been watching her cabin, perhaps even looking inside when she was away? "My husband's. Service is not relevant to this conversation," she said, her voice cooling considerably. "And I think we've concluded our business here." Thornton stepped forward, attempting to regain control of the interaction. "Please, Ms. Shepherd, consider the offer. Take some time if you need to, but be realistic about your situation here. A woman alone in this remote location is perfectly capable of making her own decisions," Catherine finished for him. "Good afternoon, gentlemen." She began to close the door, but Garrett suddenly braced his hand against it. "Mrs. Shepherd, you're not understanding the opportunity here. Mr. Thornton is being extremely generous." The pressure of his hand against the door wasn't forceful enough to be considered threatening, but the implication was clear. Catherine held her ground, meeting Garrett's gaze directly. "Remove your hand from my door," she said quietly. Inside the cabin, Ranger had risen silently to his feet. Though still out of sight from the men on the porch, his presence seemed to fill the room with coiled energy waiting to be unleashed. For a moment, tension hung in the air like the static before a lightning strike. Then Thornton reached out and clasped Garrett's shoulder. "Mike, that's enough." Garrett hesitated, then slowly withdrew his hand. Catherine noted the reluctance in the motion, the subtle message it conveyed. "This isn't over. We'll leave you to think about it," Thornton said, producing a business card, which he placed on the small table beside the door. "Call me when you're ready to discuss details. The offer stands for 2 weeks." As the men turned to leave, Cahill lingered a moment longer than the others. His gaze drifted past Catherine again, searching the interior of the cabin. "Nice place you've got," he commented. "Shame to be out here all alone, though. Anything could happen this far from town." Catherine held his gaze steadily. "I manage just fine, Mr. Cahill. A slow smile spread across his face, never reaching his eyes. "Sure you do, but everybody needs neighbors they can count on. Think about Mr. Thornton's offer. It's the friendly thing to do." He turned away, following Thornton and Garrett back to their vehicle, a black SUV with tinted windows that seemed jarringly out of place against the rustic backdrop of the valley. Catherine remained in the doorway, watching as they drove away, waiting until the sound of their engine faded completely before closing and securing the door. Only then did Ranger approach, pressing against her leg in a gesture of solidarity. Catherine knelt beside him, running her hands through his thick fur, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "They've been watching the cabin," she said quietly, more to herself than to Ranger, "and they're not going to take no for an answer." The mention of Daniel's military service and Cahill's specific interest in Ranger troubled her deeply. Few people knew the full story of how Ranger had come into her life, or the extensive training he had received. To most in Millerville, he was simply the widow shepherd's loyal dog, a companion and protector in her solitude. The reality was far more complex. Catherine moved to the window, peering out to ensure the SUV had truly departed. Satisfied they were alone, she crossed to the stone hearth, where a loose brick concealed a small compartment. From within, she withdrew a leather-bound journal filled with handwritten notes, maps, and observations. She added a detailed entry about the day's visitors, their behavior, and the implications of their knowledge about her home. As darkness fell across Hollow Creek, Catherine prepared a simple dinner for herself and a carefully measured meal for Ranger. The evening routine provided a sense of normalcy that belied the unease growing within her. The visit from Thornton and his associates marked an escalation she couldn't ignore. The cabin had been her sanctuary since Daniel's death 3 years ago. After 15 years of military life, following him from base to base, building a home wherever they were stationed, Catherine had finally found permanence in this remote valley. Daniel had purchased the property during his final deployment, planning for the retirement they would share together. Fate had other plans when an IED in a distant desert claimed his life, sending him home in a flag-draped coffin and leaving Catherine to build their dream alone. She hadn't been completely alone, though. 2 months after the funeral, a military transport had delivered Ranger to her doorstep, the working dog who had been partnered with Daniel during his final tour. The official explanation was that Ranger had been deemed unsuitable for reassignment due to the trauma of losing his handler. Catherine suspected that strings had been pulled by Daniel's commanding officer, who knew how much the bond between man and dog had meant to her husband. What wasn't officially acknowledged was the specialized training Ranger had received. Beyond the standard military working dog protocols, Ranger had been part of a specialized program teaching advanced protective tactics, including the ability to immobilize threats with devastating efficiency. Daniel had once described him as looking like a family pet, but trained to go for the throat on command. Catherine had maintained Ranger's training regimen religiously, both as a connection to Daniel and as a practical matter of security in her isolated location. Few outside the military community knew that beneath Ranger's calm exterior lay the capabilities of an elite weapon, one that responded to commands that most civilian dog owners would never need to use. As she finished washing the dishes, Catherine's thoughts turned to the veiled threats in Cahill's parting words. His interest in Ranger suggested he knew more than he should about her situation. Perhaps he had connections to military contractors or had done his research on Daniel's service record. Either way, the specific attention was concerning. Catherine dried her hands and moved to the cabinet where she kept her shotgun, a Remington 870 that Daniel had insisted she learn to use with proficiency. She checked the action and loading mechanism before returning it to its place. Next, she methodically secured the cabin's windows and doors, a nightly routine that had taken on new significance after today's visit. Ranger followed her movements, alert to the subtle signs of tension in her posture and scent. When she finally settled into the armchair by the stove with a book she wouldn't really read, the dog positioned himself where he could monitor both Catherine and the main entrance. "They'll be back," Catherine said softly, reaching down to stroke Ranger's head. "And I don't think they'll be taking no for an answer next time." Outside, the wind picked up, sending a mournful whistle through the pine trees surrounding the cabin. Catherine stared into the flames visible through the stove's iron grating, remembering Daniel's words from years ago when they had discussed his dangerous work. "The world is full of predators, Kate. The trick is making sure they don't recognize you as one of them until it's too late." As she prepared for bed, Catherine made a mental note to visit Sheriff Thompson in Millerville tomorrow. While she had little faith in the effectiveness of formal complaints against someone with Thornton's apparent connections, establishing an official record of her concerns might prove useful if the situation escalated further. What remained unspoken, even in the privacy of her thoughts, was the knowledge that if Thornton's men forced a confrontation, they would discover too late that they had grievously underestimated both the widow and her seemingly docile companion. The training that Daniel had shared with both Catherine and Ranger had prepared them for scenarios most civilians could never imagine. Training that remained sharp through Catherine's diligent practice. In the darkness of her bedroom, with Ranger settled vigilantly beside her bed, Catherine stared at the ceiling and considered her options. Selling was unthinkable. This land represented her final connection to the future she and Daniel had planned together. Fighting through legal channels seemed equally futile, given the resources Thornton clearly had at his disposal. That left standing her ground and being prepared for whatever came next. It wasn't the first time Catherine Shepherd had faced seemingly impossible odds, and she had survived loss that would have broken many others. If Thornton and his men believed, her isolation made her vulnerable. They had failed to understand the fundamental truth about her existence. Catherine hadn't survived by being weak, and Ranger hadn't earned his training by being merely a pet. As sleep finally claimed her, Catherine's last conscious thought was a grim certainty. If Thornton's men returned with intentions beyond negotiation, they would learn too late that they had threatened the wrong widow and taunted the wrong dog. Morning arrived with a soft golden light that made Hollow Creek Valley most beautiful in early autumn. Catherine rose before dawn, a habit formed during military life and maintained throughout her years in the cabin. She dressed quickly in practical clothing, sturdy jeans, a flannel shirt, and well-worn boots that bore the scars of countless hikes through the surrounding wilderness. Ranger followed her through the morning routine with practiced precision. While Catherine prepared a simple breakfast, the dog performed a perimeter check of the cabin exterior, his movements methodical as he scented the air and ground for any signs of intrusion during the night. Upon returning through the dog door built into the rear of the cabin, he gave Catherine a look she had come to recognize as the all-clear signal. "Good boy," she murmured, setting down his breakfast bowl alongside her own coffee and oatmeal at the small oak table. Through the kitchen window, she could see the mist rising from the valley floor as the first rays of sunlight crested the eastern ridge. On any other morning, the view would have brought her peace. Today, it only reinforced what she stood to lose. After breakfast, Catherine loaded Ranger into her aging but reliable Jeep Wrangler. The vehicle had been Daniel's, modified for off-road, capability with reinforced suspension and all-terrain tires that could navigate the rugged back roads of the valley in all seasons. As she steered down the winding dirt road that connected her property to the county highway, Catherine mentally rehearsed what she would say to Sheriff Thompson. Millerville came into view after a 40-minute drive. a small town that had seen better days, but maintained a certain frontier charm. Once a thriving logging community, it had dwindled over decades as the timber industry contracted. Main Street featured the essential businesses that supported the remaining population: a general store that doubled as the post office, a diner, a hardware store, and a modest medical clinic staffed 3 days a week by a physician's assistant from the larger town of Preston, some 60 miles east. Catherine parked in front of the sheriff's office, a single-story brick building that also housed the town's 3-cell jail and the municipal court that convened once monthly. As she switched off the engine, she caught sight of a familiar black SUV parked further down the street in front of the diner. "Looks like our friends are in town," she said to Ranger, who had noticed the vehicle before she had, his eyes fixed on it with focused attention. "Stay alert." Inside the sheriff's office, Deputy Morris looked up from his computer with surprise. "Mrs. Shepherd, don't often see you in town twice in the same month." "It's Ms.," Catherine corrected gently. "Is Sheriff Thompson available?" Deputy Morris, barely 25, with an earnest face that seemed too young for his uniform, glanced toward the closed door of the inner office. "He's on a call right now, but shouldn't be long. Mind waiting?" Catherine nodded and took a seat in one of the plastic chairs lining the wall. The deputy's eyes drifted to Ranger, who had positioned himself at Catherine's feet, his posture alert but relaxed. "That's some dog you've got," Morris commented. "German Shepherd, right? My cousin trains police K9s over in Westfield." "Yes," Catherine replied, offering no additional information about Ranger's more specialized background. "He's a good companion." Morris seemed about to ask more when the inner door opened and Sheriff Thompson emerged, followed by a man Catherine recognized as Mayor Phillips. Both men stopped short at the sight of her. "Catherine," the sheriff nodded, his weathered face showing brief surprise before settling back into its customary neutral expression. At 58, Jim Thompson had served as Millerville's sheriff for nearly 20 years. His salt-and-pepper hair and the deep lines around his eyes spoke of the challenges of maintaining order in a community that was slowly dying. "Sheriff, Mayor," Catherine acknowledged them both with a slight nod. Mayor Phillips, a corpulent man whose suit strained against his ample midsection, offered a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Ms. Shepherd, what a coincidence. We were just discussing the exciting development opportunities coming to the valley." Catherine wasn't surprised. Phillips had campaigned on promises of economic revival, and a major highway project represented exactly the kind of progress he had pledged to bring to Millerville. "I need to speak with you, Sheriff," Catherine said, ignoring the mayor's comment. "It's regarding some visitors I had at my property yesterday." Thompson's expression remained unreadable, but something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or concern. "Of course, come into my office." "Actually, I should be going," Mayor Phillips interjected. "Got that meeting at the diner." He turned to Catherine with forced joviality. "Don't be a stranger now, Miss Shepherd. Exciting times ahead for our little community." As the mayor departed, Sheriff Thompson gestured Catherine into his office. The space was utilitarian, a metal desk covered with files, 2 visitor chairs, and walls lined with filing cabinets and local ordnance books. The only personal touches were a faded photograph of a younger Thompson in military uniform and a painted wooden sign that read, "The truth is still the truth, even when no one believes it." "I assume your visitors were from Black Pine Development," Thompson said, without preamble once the door was closed. Ranger settled beside Catherine's chair, his eyes never leaving the sheriff. "Ray Thornton and 2 men he introduced as Mike Garrett and Liam Cahill," Catherine confirmed. "You know them." Thompson sighed, settling into his creaking office chair. "Thornton's been in and out of town for months now, buying up properties. The other 2 showed up last week. Been staying at the motel on the edge of town." "What do you know about them?" The sheriff's mouth tightened into a thin line. "Officially, They work for Black Pine's Community Relations Department. Unofficially, I ran their names through the system. Garrett's got a record, assault charges that were dropped under mysterious circumstances in 3 different states. Cahill's cleaner on paper, but my contact in the state police says he's suspected of involvement in some property arsons over in Riverside County. Convenient fires that changed reluctant sellers' minds. Catherine absorbed this information without visible reaction, though it confirmed her instincts about the men. They made implied threats during their visit, suggested it might be dangerous for a woman alone so far from town. Implied threats aren't actionable, Thompson said, frustration evident in his tone. I can document your complaint, but without direct evidence. I understand, Catherine said. I'm not expecting arrests, just creating a record in case things escalate. Smart. Thompson pulled a form from his desk drawer and began filling it out. The development has a lot of support in town. Mayor's convinced it'll bring Millerville back from the brink. New jobs, increased property values, the whole salvation package. He looked up, meeting Catherine's eyes directly. I'm not so sure. Seen too many small towns get chewed up and spit out by these kinds of projects. You don't think the highway's coming? Oh, it's coming, Thompson confirmed. Routes, been approved by the county commission. What I'm not convinced of is who benefits. Black Pine's buying land at 3 times market value now, but once they've secured the route, what happens to the folks who held out? What happens to Millerville when the construction crews leave and we're just another exit sign people blow past at 70 miles an hour? Catherine appreciated Thompson's perspective. Like her, he'd seen enough of the world to recognize when opportunists disguise themselves as benefactors. Have other property owners reported pressure tactics? Thompson hesitated before responding. Nothing official. Old man Jenkins mentioned some persistent young fellas who kept showing up after he initially declined to sell. Week later, his barn burned down. Investigation found nothing conclusive, but Jenkins sold up the next day. He leaned forward slightly. You're different, though. Your place is strategic, controls access to the upper valley and the watershed. From what I gather, they've got a revised route that cuts through your land. That's what Thornton claimed. Catherine confirmed. Are you planning to sell? Thompson asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. No. The sheriff nodded, unsurprised. Didn't think so. He finished filling out the form and pushed it across the desk for her signature. Be careful, Catherine. These corporate types don't like obstacles, and they've got resources we can't match in a town this size. I can handle myself, Catherine replied evenly, signing the form. I don't doubt that, Thompson said, his gaze shifting briefly to Ranger. Daniel made sure of it. But these men play by different rules. The mention of her late husband brought a momentary tightness to Catherine's chest. She and Thompson shared the connection of military service, he in the Marines, Daniel in Army Special Forces. That mutual understanding had formed the basis of a quiet respect between them over the years. I appreciate the warning, Catherine said, rising to leave. If anything happens, you'll be my first call. Thompson stood as well. I'll increase patrols past your turnoff when I can, but with budget cuts, we're spread thin. 2 deputies and myself for the whole county. He hesitated, then added, might want to make sure your security measures are up to date. Trail cameras, that sort of thing. Catherine understood the subtext. Document everything. Create evidence that would stand up if matters escalated to legal action. Already on my list for today, she assured him. As Catherine exited the sheriff's office with Ranger at her heel, she noticed the mayor emerging from the diner across the street. Beside him walked Ray Thornton, engaged in animated conversation. Behind them followed Cahill, whose gaze immediately locked onto Catherine and Ranger. He nudged Thornton, who looked up and spotted her as well. Catherine maintained her pace, heading directly for her jeep. She had no interest in another confrontation, particularly in the middle of Main Street, where any exchange would feed the town gossip mill for weeks. Ranger sensed the shift in her energy. his posture becoming more alert, as he kept pace beside her. To an observer, the dog appeared merely attentive, but Catherine knew the subtle signs of his heightened awareness, the slight forward tilt of his ears, the minute tension in his powerful shoulders. "Miss Shepherd," Mayor Phillips called, breaking away from his companions and hurrying across the street with surprising agility for a man of his size. "Hold up a minute!" Catherine paused at her vehicle, one hand resting on Ranger's head, in a gesture that appeared casual, but conveyed a specific command. "Remain calm, but vigilant." "Mayor," she acknowledged as Phillips approached, slightly winded from his short jog across the street. Behind him, Thornton and Cahill followed at a more measured pace. "Just wanted to make sure you're considering the wonderful opportunity Mr. Thornton has presented," Phillips said, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "This highway project is going to transform our community, really put Millerville on the map." "I've heard the pitch," Catherine replied neutrally. "The mayor's been incredibly supportive of progressive development in the region," Thornton interjected as he reached them, extending his hand as though their previous encounter had been entirely cordial. Catherine did not take it, and after an awkward moment he lowered his arm. "We were just discussing the community benefits package Black Pine is prepared to offer Millerville. New municipal building, renovated school facilities, expanded clinic hours," Phillips elaborated eagerly. "The kind of investment this town hasn't seen in decades. Contingent on securing the optimal route, of course," Thornton added, his eyes fixed on Catherine. The implication was clear. Her cooperation, or lack thereof, would determine whether these promised benefits materialized for Millerville. It was a calculated pressure tactic, using community need as leverage against her personal decision. "The town's welfare is important to me," Catherine said carefully. "But so is the integrity of the valley and the right of property owners to make decisions without coercion." Phillips's florid face darkened slightly. "No one's talking about coercion, Catherine. This is about progress. The kind of opportunity that comes along once in a generation." Cahill, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. His attention was focused not on Catherine but on Ranger, who stood perfectly still under the man's scrutiny. "That's a fine animal," Cahill commented, reaching toward Ranger as if to pat his head. In a motion almost too quick to follow, Catherine shifted her position slightly, placing herself between Cahill and the dog. "He doesn't like being touched by strangers." Cahill withdrew his hand, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Military trained, right? I've worked with dogs like him before. They respond to very specific commands." His eyes met Catherine's, a calculation evident in his gaze. "Wonder what commands this one knows." The comment carried an undertone that raised Catherine's internal alert level. Cahill wasn't simply making conversation. He was probing, testing, seeking information about Ranger's capabilities. "He knows enough," Catherine replied evenly. "I'm sure he does," Cahill said, the smile never reaching his eyes. "German shepherds are intelligent animals, loyalty to their handlers above all else, but even the best-trained dog can be unpredictable when provoked." The statement hung in the air between them, its threatening implications clear despite the casual delivery. Mayor Phillips seemed oblivious to the undercurrent, but Thornton placed a restraining hand on Cahill's shoulder. "We should let Miss Shepherd get on with her day," Thornton said smoothly. "I'm sure she has much to consider." Catherine held Cahill's gaze for a moment longer before turning to unlock her jeep. "Yes, I have supplies to purchase before heading back." As she opened the door for Ranger to jump into the passenger seat, Mayor Phillips made one final attempt. "Catherine, please think about what this could mean for Millerville. We need this development." "I'll take that under advisement, Mayor," she replied, her tone making it clear that the conversation was over. She climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine, pulling away from the curb without a backward glance. In her rearview mirror, she could see the three men watching her departure, Phillips looking disappointed, Thornton impassive, and Cahill with that same calculating expression that had set alarm bells ringing in Catherine's mind. Instead of heading directly home, Catherine drove to Preston Hardware on the outskirts of town. The sprawling store catered to the rural community's needs with everything from agricultural supplies to hunting equipment. Walter Preston, the third-generation owner, greeted her warmly as she entered. "Catherine, what brings you into town today?" "Need some security upgrades, Walt," she replied. "Trail cameras, motion sensors, that sort of thing." Preston nodded sagely. "Heard about Black Pine moving into the valley. Guess you're having the same thoughts a lot of folks are these days." "Something like that," Catherine acknowledged. "Got just what you need," Preston assured her, leading the way to the store's security section. "These new models can send alerts straight to your phone, assuming you get a signal up there at your place." "I get enough for texts to come through," Catherine said. The isolation of her property was both a blessing and a challenge. Peaceful, but vulnerable without the technological connections most people took for granted. With Preston's guidance, Catherine selected 4 trail cameras with night vision capabilities, motion-activated floodlights for the cabin exterior, and a solar-powered perimeter alert system designed for remote properties. The total came to more than she had planned to spend, but after the encounters with Thornton's men, she considered it a necessary investment. As Preston rang up her purchases, he lowered his voice. "Heard what happened to Jenkins's barn. Nobody's saying it outright, but—" "I know," Catherine replied. "I'll be careful." "Daniel was a good man," Preston said, his expression somber. "Helped my boy when he came back from Afghanistan all torn up inside. Never asked for anything in return." He finished bagging the security equipment and pushed an additional package across the counter. "This one's on the house. Extra batteries. For the cameras. They drain fast in cold weather." Catherine accepted the unexpected kindness with gratitude. "Thank you, Walt." "Community looks after its own," Preston replied simply. "Or at least it should." The comment stayed with Catherine as she completed her errands in town, stopping at the general store for supplies and filling the Jeep's tank at the single gas station that served Millerville. Throughout, she remained acutely aware of the black SUV that appeared periodically in her vicinity, never following directly, but maintaining a presence just visible enough to be noticed. They were sending a message, establishing that her movements were being monitored. It was a tactic designed to create unease, a continuous low-level threat that wore down resistance over time. It was also a mistake. Anyone with actual knowledge of Catherine's background would have recognized that such surveillance would only heighten her resolve rather than diminish it. Years as a military spouse had taught her to function effectively under pressure, to maintain operational security even in seemingly casual situations, and to recognize intimidation tactics for what they were. By mid-afternoon, Catherine was heading back toward Hollow Creek, her Jeep loaded with supplies and security equipment. Ranger sat alertly in the passenger seat, occasionally glancing at the side mirrors as though aware they were being monitored. "They're making it pretty obvious, aren't they?" Catherine commented as she navigated the winding county road that led toward her property. "Not exactly subtle." Ranger's ears perked at the sound of her voice, his intelligent eyes meeting hers briefly before returning to their vigilant watch. As the Jeep climbed higher into the valley, Catherine's thoughts turned to the installation of her new security measures. The cameras would need to be strategically placed to cover the approach roads and the cabin perimeter. The motion sensors required careful calibration to avoid false alarms from wildlife while still detecting human intrusion. She had just passed the weathered wooden sign marking the boundary of her property when she noticed the fresh tire tracks, cutting across the normally undisturbed gravel of her driveway. Someone had been to the cabin while she was in town. Catherine slowed the Jeep, her senses heightening as she assessed the situation. Beside her, Ranger had also noticed the disturbance, his body tensing as he detected unfamiliar scents on the air, coming through the partially opened window. "Easy," Catherine murmured, both to Ranger and herself. She reached beneath her seat, fingers closing around the reassuring grip of the 9mm handgun Daniel had insisted she keep with her at all times. Another habit from their military life that had carried into her widowhood. As the cabin came into view around the final bend in the drive, Catherine scanned for signs of intrusion or damage. Nothing appeared immediately out of place. The structure stood as she had left it. Windows intact, door closed. Yet the fresh tracks leading up to the cabin and then away again confirmed that visitors had come during her absence. Stopping the jeep 30 yards from the cabin, Catherine considered her options. Standard procedure would be to approach cautiously, clear the structure, and then assess for tampering or surveillance devices. But if Thornton's men had indeed been here, they might be expecting exactly that reaction, might even be watching now to observe her response. Better to appear unaware, she decided. Let them think their visit had gone unnoticed while she implemented her security upgrades and gathered evidence of the trespassing. "Come on, boy," she said to Ranger as she restarted the jeep and continued up the drive at a normal pace. "Let's get home and unload these supplies, then we've got some work to do." As they approached the cabin, Ranger's heightened alertness told Catherine everything she needed to know. Someone unfamiliar had definitely been here, recently enough that their scent remained strong enough for the dog to detect. The question was what they had done, and what message they were trying to send. Catherine suspected she wouldn't have to search long to discover the answer. Dawn broke over Hollow Creek with a somber grey light filtering through low clouds that promised rain by afternoon. Catherine had slept in 90-minute cycles throughout the night, a pattern ingrained during Daniel's deployments when uncertainty demanded vigilance without complete exhaustion. Ranger had maintained his own watch, alternating between alert rest near the bedroom door and periodic patrols of the cabin interior. Catherine rose from bed at the first hint of daylight, moving through her morning routine with heightened awareness. Coffee brewing on the wood stove filled the cabin with its familiar aroma, a small normalcy in a situation that had shifted dramatically in the past 48 hours. She dressed practically in cargo pants, a moisture-wicking thermal shirt, and a flannel overshirt, layers that offered both utility and flexibility for whatever the day might bring. The tablet displaying her security feeds showed no overnight alerts, though Catherine wasn't particularly surprised. After Miller's visit and her activation of the Sentinel protocol, she expected a brief lull while Black Pine regrouped and planned their next move. The countdown to the county commissioners' meeting created a definitive timeline. Whatever Thornton intended would happen soon, likely within the next 24 hours. Catherine's satellite phone chimed as she finished her first cup of coffee. The text was brief, but substantive. Initial intelligence packet incoming. Secure transmission at 0830. She checked her watch, just past 6 in the morning, giving her nearly 3 hours to prepare. While waiting for the intelligence, Catherine implemented additional security measures around the cabin. Using materials from her storage shed, she established subtle early warning systems at key approach points. Arrangements of dry branches positioned to create distinctive sounds when disturbed, reflective markers visible only from specific angles inside the cabin, and passive barriers that would channel anyone approaching along predictable paths. These weren't meant to stop determined intruders, but rather to ensure she would have advance warning and positional advantage if Thornton's men attempted a direct approach. Catherine worked methodically, her movements efficient and purposeful. Ranger patrolled the perimeter as she worked, his presence ensuring no observers could approach undetected. By 8 o'clock, with light rain beginning to patter against the cabin roof, Catherine had completed her external preparations. She returned, inside, changed into dry clothes, and prepared the secure communication system that had remained unused in her storage shed until yesterday. The encrypted laptop connected to the satellite link represented military-grade technology that Daniel had insisted she maintain, just in case. Another precaution that had seemed excessive until now. At precisely 8:30, the system activated. With an incoming transmission, Catherine entered the authentication sequence and opened the secure file that appeared on the screen. What followed was a comprehensive intelligence brief on Blackpine development and its key personnel, information gathered with resources and access far beyond what Sheriff Thompson could access through normal law enforcement channels. Blackpine, it turned out, was a shell corporation nested within a complex structure of holding companies. Its true ownership traced back to Clearwater Strategic Resources, a private military contractor with connections to several international resource extraction operations. The company specialized in securing developmental interests in contested regions, a euphemism for the strong-arm tactics Catherine had experienced firsthand. Ray Thornton's background was particularly illuminating. Prior to his role with Blackpine, he had worked as a regional acquisitions specialist for mining operations in South America and West Africa. His methods had drawn scrutiny from human rights organizations after several indigenous communities were displaced under circumstances that included mysterious property damage, unexplained accidents, and physical intimidation of community leaders. Mike Garrett had an even more concerning history. Dishonorable discharge from the Marines following allegations of excessive force against civilians during his third deployment, followed by private security work with firms known for hiring operators with questionable records. His specialization was listed as asset denial operations, a sanitized term for ensuring targets couldn't use their resources against client interests. Most troubling was Liam Cahill's background. Unlike the others, he had an exemplary military record as a handler in a military working dog program, specifically the same specialized unit that had trained Ranger. His expertise with tactical canine assets explained his particular interest in Ranger, as well as his understanding of command structures and capabilities. After leaving the military, Cahill had worked for several private military contractors before joining Clearwater's domestic acquisition division. The intelligence brief concluded with the most critical revelation. Geological surveys conducted by Blackpine had identified potential rare earth mineral deposits throughout Hollow Creek Valley. Catherine's property sat at the epicenter of the richest concentration, explaining why the company had purchased surrounding lands at inflated prices while pressing so aggressively for her parcel. The proposed highway wasn't just about transportation. It was about establishing infrastructure for what would eventually become a mining operation. Catherine processed this information with growing clarity about her situation. She wasn't facing simple developers or even ordinary criminals. She was opposing a corporate entity accustomed to removing obstacles by any means necessary, staffed by individuals with military and paramilitary backgrounds who operated according to their own rules. The rain intensified outside, drumming steadily against the cabin roof as Catherine developed her response strategy. The final section of the intelligence brief offered a crucial advantage: a secure communication channel to Sheriff Thompson, who had been quietly identified as a potential ally based on his own military background and apparent resistance to Blackpine's influence in Millerville. Catherine initiated this connection immediately, sending a concise summary of the intelligence on Blackpine's true nature and intentions. Thompson's response came quickly. Suspected something like this: mayor and commissioners compromised, FBI contact from Preston, arriving 1400 hours, hold position until then. The promise of federal intervention provided some reassurance, but Catherine had no illusions about timing. If Black Pine was as professional as their background suggested, they would have contingency plans for legal scrutiny. The approaching county commission meeting created a deadline that might accelerate their actions against her property. Catherine secured the laptop in its hidden compartment and checked her watch. Just past 10 in the morning. The rain had settled into a steady downpour that reduced visibility and muffled sounds, creating conditions that tactically favored those with knowledge of the terrain. She moved through the cabin, adjusting her defensive preparations for poor weather conditions. Ranger remained alert, despite the soporific effect of the rainfall, his training overriding the natural canine tendency to rest during such weather. At 11:30, the perimeter alarm triggered with a subtle vibration against Catherine's wrist. She moved immediately to the security tablet, which displayed footage from the easternmost camera, a black SUV parking at the entrance to her access road, approximately half a mile from the cabin. 3 figures emerged, dressed in dark rain gear that obscured their features. Instead of proceeding directly up the road, the men moved into the forest on either side, a tactical approach that confirmed Catherine's assessment of their intentions. They weren't coming for negotiations. Catherine activated the cabin's defensive protocol with swift efficiency. First, she verified the satellite phone was secured in its waterproof case and concealed in the emergency cache beneath the porch, a communication line that would remain accessible even if she lost control of the cabin. Next, she positioned her weapons strategically throughout the structure. The shotgun near the front door, the handgun in a kitchen drawer, the hunting rifle within reach of the bedroom window that overlooked the main approach. Finally, she retrieved a small metal case from beneath her bed, opening it to reveal specialized equipment she had hoped never to use. Inside lay 2 items, a military-grade throat microphone with a nearly invisible earpiece that would allow hands-free communication, with Ranger and a tactical harness designed specifically for military working dogs. The harness featured mounting points for specialized equipment, but more importantly, it served as a psychological trigger for Ranger. When wearing it, he shifted fully from companion to operative. Catherine fitted the communication system to herself first, testing it with a sub-vocalized command that Ranger immediately responded to, despite the command being inaudible to normal hearing. Then she approached the German Shepherd with the harness. "Time to work, Ranger," she said quietly, holding the tactical gear where he could clearly see it. The change in the dog was subtle but profound. His posture straightened, his focus sharpened, and the last vestiges of pet-like behavior vanished, as he allowed Catherine to secure the harness around his powerful frame. This wasn't the first time they had drilled with the equipment. Catherine had maintained regular training sessions throughout the years, both to honor Daniel's legacy and to preserve capabilities that part of her had always known might someday be necessary. With Ranger prepared, Catherine made a final check of the cabin's defenses before taking a position at the front window, where she could monitor approaches without being easily visible from outside. The rain continued to fall, reducing visibility and creating a constant backdrop of white noise that would mask subtle sounds of movement. Through her security feed, Catherine tracked the men's progress. They had separated, using standard flanking tactics to approach the cabin from multiple angles simultaneously. Their movement through the forest was professional, not the clumsy advance of ordinary trespassers, but the practiced approach of individuals with tactical training. Catherine recognized Garrett taking the direct route up the access road, while Cahill circled to approach from the west side near the storage shed. The third figure, presumably Thornton, established a position on higher ground to the north, likely coordinating the operation while maintaining visual oversight. The approach pattern confirmed Catherine's suspicions. This wasn't a simple intimidation visit, but a coordinated action intended to secure her property by force. The timing, during heavy rain with limited visibility on the day before the county commission meeting had been carefully selected to minimize witnesses and maximize their advantage. What they couldn't know was how thoroughly Catherine had prepared for exactly this scenario. As Garrett reached the first of her early warning systems, a carefully arranged line of branches across a narrow section of the path, Catherine sub-vocalized a command through the throat microphone. "Ranger, position Alpha." The German Shepherd moved silently to the predetermined location near the side window, where he could monitor the western approach without being visible from outside. His posture was perfectly controlled. Body coiled with potential energy yet completely still, the specialized stillness that distinguished tactical canine assets from ordinary dogs. The security tablet showed Garrett pausing at the branch arrangement, clearly recognizing it as a deliberate placement rather than natural debris. Instead of disturbing it directly, he carefully stepped over, a professional response that indicated his level of training. He continued toward the cabin with increased caution, one hand inside his rain jacket, where Catherine presumed he carried a concealed weapon. Catherine's attention shifted to Cahill, whose approach from the west demonstrated even greater tactical awareness. He moved from cover to cover, minimizing his exposure while maintaining constant awareness of sightlines from the cabin windows. His familiarity with working dog protocols made him the most dangerous of the three. He would understand Rangers' capabilities and potentially anticipate standard handler tactics. When all three men had reached positions within 70 yards of the cabin, they paused simultaneously, suggesting communication through their own earpieces. Catherine watched as they adjusted their positions slightly, establishing a triangulation pattern that would allow them to observe all sides of the structure. For nearly 20 minutes, they maintained these positions without advancing further, studying the cabin and its surroundings. Catherine recognized the tactic. They were assessing defensive preparations, looking for signs of awareness or traps before committing to final approach. The patients demonstrated their professionalism and reinforced her assessment of the threat they posed. Eventually, Garrett resumed his approach up the main path toward the front door. His posture projected casual confidence, as though he were simply a visitor calling during inclement weather. Catherine recognized the psychological tactic, appearing non-threatening to draw her into opening the door, creating an immediate vulnerability in her defensive position. When Garrett reached the edge of the clearing, approximately 50 yards from the cabin, Catherine made her first move. Using the remote trigger she had installed earlier that morning, she activated the floodlights mounted beneath the cabin's eaves, instantly illuminating the rain-soaked clearing and destroying the visual adaptation Garrett had established during his approach through the dimmer forest. The sudden brightness caused him to instinctively raise a hand to shield his eyes, momentarily disoriented. Through her security feed, Catherine saw Cahill immediately drop to a crouch, recognizing the tactical significance of the lighting change, while Thornton remained in his elevated position, now speaking urgently into what appeared to be a communication device of his own. Catherine activated the cabin's external speaker system, another of Daniel's precautionary installations. Her voice carried clearly through the rainfall. "This is private property. You are trespassing. Leave immediately." Garrett recovered quickly from the light activation, resuming his approach with his right hand now visible and raised in a gesture of non-threat. "Ms. Shepherd," he called out, his voice carrying easily despite the rain. "We just need to talk. Mr. Thornton sent us an urgent revised offer." The pretense was paper-thin, a final attempt to maintain deniability if witnessed or recorded. Catherine had expected this approach based on their previous interactions. "Any offer can be delivered through proper legal channels," she responded through the speaker system. "Leave my property now. Sheriff Thompson has been notified of your presence." At the mention of law enforcement, Garrett's posture shifted subtly, the false friendliness hardening into something more predatory. Behind him, Cahill had begun moving again, using the distraction of the conversation to advance his position along the western side of the clearing. Catherine tracked both men's movements while maintaining awareness of Thornton's elevated position. The situation was developing exactly as she had anticipated, Garrett serving as the visible distraction, while Cahill maneuvered for a less obvious approach. Standard tactics for a team accustomed to operating with superior numbers against isolated targets. "Ms. Shepherd," Garrett tried again, continuing his advance despite her warning. "You're being unreasonable. The county has already approved the route through your property. This is just a formality to avoid legal complications." The lie was bold. The commission meeting wasn't scheduled until the following day. Its purpose was clear: to suggest resistance was futile, that her options had already been eliminated through official channels. "Final warning," Catherine responded, her voice steady through the speaker system. "Leave now or face trespassing charges." Garrett had reached the bottom of the porch steps, close enough now that Catherine could see the calculating expression on his face through the rain. "Ma'am, you're alone up here, miles from help. Being difficult just makes this harder on everyone." The implied threat hung in the rain-heavy air as Garrett placed one foot on the bottom step. Through her security feed, Catherine saw Cahill had reached the side of the storage shed, now less than 30 yards from the cabin's western entrance. Thornton remained in his elevated position, apparently coordinating rather than directly participating. The moment had arrived for Catherine to demonstrate that their assessment of her vulnerability was fundamentally flawed. She subvocalized her command through the throat microphone. "Ranger warning protocol." The German Shepherd moved instantly from his concealed position to the front window, becoming visible to Garrett for the first time. Unlike his normal alert posture, Ranger now displayed the full threat profile he had been trained to project, teeth bared in a silent snarl, body forward in pre-launch position, every aspect of his bearing communicating imminent violence controlled only by his handlers. "Command." The effect on Garrett was immediate. Despite his training, he took an involuntary step backward, his hand moving reflexively toward whatever weapon he carried concealed. The reaction confirmed Catherine's assessment. These men might be professionals, but they weren't prepared for a military-grade canine threat. "That's an impressive animal, Ms. Shepherd," Garrett called out, his tone shifting to something more cautious. "But we still need to resolve this situation today." Catherine's response came not through the speaker system, but directly as she opened the front door, positioning herself strategically behind the partial cover it provided. The shotgun was visible in her hands, held with the confidence of someone thoroughly familiar with its operation. "Mr. Garrett," she said, her voice carrying naturally across the short distance between them, "I'm going to make this very clear. I know who you work for. I know your background. I know about Clearwater Strategic Resources and their interest in the mineral deposits under my property." Garrett's expression transformed, shock briefly overtaking his professional composure before he reasserted control. The revelation that Catherine possessed intelligence about Black Pine's true ownership and objectives clearly hadn't been part of his operational briefing. "I don't know what you're talking about," he attempted, though the conviction had drained from his voice. "We both know that's not true," Catherine replied evenly, "just as we both know you're not here to negotiate. Cahill's position behind my storage shed suggests a very different intention." This second revelation, that she was aware of Cahill's flanking maneuver, caused Garrett to glance briefly toward his colleague's position, another breach of professional discipline that demonstrated how thoroughly Catherine had disrupted their operational assumptions. In his elevated position, Thornton was now speaking urgently into his communication device, likely reassessing their approach based on Catherine's unexpected level of awareness and preparation. "Now," Catherine continued, maintaining her position of partial cover with the shotgun visible but not directly aimed, "you have a choice. You can leave my property immediately, or I can demonstrate exactly why attempting to forcibly remove me would be a serious tactical error. Garrett appeared momentarily frozen, caught between the operational plan he had been executing and the rapidly deteriorating tactical situation. Through the earpiece linked to Ranger's throat microphone, Catherine detected the subtle sounds of movement from Cahill's position, not retreating but adjusting for a potential alternate approach. The tension stretched between them, magnified by the steady rainfall that had soaked Garrett, while Catherine remained relatively dry in her position at the door. Finally, Garrett's hand emerged from inside his jacket, slowly, deliberately non-threatening, holding what appeared to be a satellite phone similar to Catherine's own. "I need to consult with my supervisor," he said, the professional mask reasserting itself despite the setback. "This situation has parameters I wasn't briefed on." Catherine nodded once, maintaining her vigilant posture. "Make your call." But neither you nor your colleagues are to approach the cabin further. As Garrett stepped away to converse privately, Catherine sub-vocalized another command to Ranger. "Monitor west perimeter." The German shepherd moved silently from the window to a position where he could track Cahill's movements while remaining within Catherine's sightline. The confrontation had reached its first critical juncture. Catherine had successfully disrupted their initial approach and demonstrated a level of preparation they hadn't anticipated. Now came the more dangerous phase, when they would either retreat to reconsider or escalate to overcome the unexpected resistance. What they decided would determine whether the tense standoff dissolved into an uneasy withdrawal or erupted into the violent confrontation Catherine was prepared for but hoped to avoid. Either way, she had fundamentally changed the equation by revealing that neither she nor Ranger were the vulnerable targets Black Pine had assessed them to be. The rain continued to fall steadily, creating a curtain of water that partially obscured Garrett as he spoke urgently into his satellite phone, gesturing occasionally toward the cabin where Catherine maintained her defensive position. Whatever instructions he was receiving would determine the next phase of what had become a tactical chess match with potentially lethal stakes. Catherine remained perfectly still, the shotgun held at ready position, while Ranger maintained his silent vigilance of Cahill's movements along the western approach. The specialized training that had once seemed like an echo of a life left behind had now become the foundation of their defense against men who had gravely underestimated what it meant to threaten a widow with nothing left to lose and a dog trained to protect her at all costs. The rain drummed against the cabin roof with increasing intensity as Catherine maintained her position at the partially open door. Through the grey curtain of water, she watched Garrett conclude his call and turn back toward the cabin. His body language had shifted, the earlier confidence replaced by a more measured caution that told Catherine his superiors had adjusted their approach based on her unexpected level of preparation. "Miss Shepherd," Garrett called out, remaining at the bottom of the porch steps rather than attempting to advance further. "It seems there's been a misunderstanding. Mr. Thornton would like to speak with you directly to clear things up." Catherine's response was measured, revealing nothing of her tactical calculations. "Mr. Thornton can approach alone and unarmed. You and Mr. Cahill will return to your vehicle." The mention of Cahill by name, coupled with the clear knowledge of his position, caused another flash of unease to cross Garrett's face. He glanced toward the western side of the property, where his colleague remained partially concealed behind the storage shed. "That's not necessary," Garrett attempted. "We're just here to talk." "Those are my terms," Catherine interrupted, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. "And Mr. Cahill can stop trying to circle behind the cabin. My security systems track movement on all approaches." This was partially a bluff. Her trail cameras covered the main approaches, but not every possible angle. The statement's purpose was psychological, reinforcing the impression that her preparations were more comprehensive than they had anticipated. Garrett raised his hand to his ear, apparently receiving instructions through an earpiece. After a moment, he nodded reluctantly. "All right, Mr. Thornton will come down to speak with you. We'll wait by the vehicle." "All the way to the vehicle," Catherine emphasized. "If either of you approach within 100 yards of this cabin while Mr. Thornton is here, this conversation ends immediately." The implicit threat remained unstated but clear. Catherine watched as Garrett relayed these conditions through his communication device, his expression revealing frustration at the disruption of whatever plan they had originally intended to execute. After a tense moment, Cahill emerged from his position near the storage shed, raising his hand slightly to indicate compliance. Unlike Garrett, whose demeanor betrayed his discomfort with the situation, Cahill's movements remained precisely controlled, his eyes constantly scanning for tactical information as he backed slowly toward the access road. From his elevated position on the northern ridge, Thornton began descending toward the cabin. Even at a distance, his movements displayed the practiced casualness of someone accustomed to negotiations under pressure. Like his colleagues, he wore dark rain gear, though his carried the subtle markers of higher quality, small distinctions that reinforced his position as the decision-maker in their operation. Catherine used these moments to sub-vocalize instructions. To Ranger through the throat microphone, passive observation protocol. Alert on weapon presentation. The German Shepherd adjusted his position slightly, maintaining his alert status while reducing the overt aggression in his posture, shifting from active threat to vigilant guardian. As Thornton approached the clearing, Catherine noted the contrast between his composed advance and Garrett's earlier tension. This was a man accustomed to controlling situations through force of personality rather than physical intimidation. In many ways, that made him more dangerous than his more obviously threatening colleagues. When he reached the bottom of the porch steps, Thornton removed his rain hood, revealing the same carefully groomed appearance Catherine remembered from their previous encounters, though now his expression carried a calculating assessment rather than the false cordiality he had initially presented. "Miss Shepherd," he greeted her, his voice pitched to carry clearly through the rainfall. "This situation has become unnecessarily complicated. I'd like to resolve it amicably." "By sending armed men to my property during a rainstorm," Catherine replied, maintaining her position at the partially open door, with the shotgun visible but not directly aimed. "Your definition of amicable needs revision, Mr. Thornton." A thin smile crossed Thornton's face, not amusement, but acknowledgement. "A precautionary measure given the isolated location. I assure you, our intention was simply to ensure a productive conversation." "Let's dispense with the pretense," Catherine said, her patience for his corporate doublespeak exhausted. "Clearwater Strategic Resources wants the mineral deposits under my property. The highway project is just a convenient cover for establishing mining infrastructure." Thornton's expression flickered briefly, surprise quickly masked by professional composure. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted from placating to pragmatic. "You're remarkably well-informed, Miss Shepherd, which raises the question of who's providing you with that information." "Does it matter?" Catherine countered. "What matters is that I know Black Pine's true agenda, and I have no intention of selling my property. Not for a highway, not for a mine, not at any price." Thornton studied her for a long moment, rainwater streaming from his expensive jacket as he reassessed his approach. "You're making this more difficult than necessary. The county commissioners will approve our revised route tomorrow regardless of your position. We're simply offering you the opportunity to benefit financially rather than face eminent domain proceedings." "We both know that's not how this works," Catherine replied evenly. "The commissioners haven't approved anything yet. That's why you're here, to ensure there's no opposition at tomorrow's meeting by removing me from the equation today." Another flash of calculation crossed Thornton's face, followed by a decision to abandon pretense entirely. "You seem to understand the situation perfectly, Ms. Shepherd, which is why I'm surprised by your resistance. A woman in your position, alone, isolated with limited resources, would typically recognize when tactical retreat is the wiser option." "Your assessment of my position is flawed," Catherine stated simply, "as is your evaluation of my resources." Thornton's gaze shifted briefly to Ranger, who remained vigilant beside Catherine. "The dog is impressive, certainly, military trained based on his bearing. Your late husband's service animal, I assume. But even specialized canine assets have their limitations against determined opposition." The casual reference to Daniel and the clinical assessment of Ranger as an asset rather than an animal revealed Thornton's familiarity with military terminology. "Another confirmation of Clearwater's operational background. Mr. Thornton," Catherine said, her voice cooling, "I'll be direct. I know about your company's methods in South America and West Africa. I know about Garrett's dishonorable discharge, and Cahill's background with military working dogs. I know you've used arson, staged accidents, and direct intimidation to remove obstacles to your acquisition plans." She paused, allowing the depth of her intelligence to register. "I also know that Sheriff Thompson has contacted federal authorities regarding your operations in this valley, and that FBI agents are currently en route to Millerville." This final revelation visibly impacted Thornton's composure. His expression hardened, the last vestiges of professional negotiation falling away. "That changes the timeline, not the outcome. This property will be secured, Miss Shepherd, today, through financial compensation if you're reasonable, or through other means if you're not." "Is that a threat?" Catherine asked, though the answer was obvious. "It's a reality," Thornton replied, his tone matter-of-fact rather than menacing. "Clearwater has invested millions in preliminary geological surveys and property acquisitions throughout this valley. The rare earth deposits beneath your land represent billions in potential revenue. Individual property rights, while admirable in principle, don't ultimately prevail against that scale of economic interest." The naked calculus of his statement, the open acknowledgement that her rights would be sacrificed for corporate profit, confirmed everything Catherine had suspected about Black Pine's true nature. "I appreciate your honesty, Mr. Thornton," she said. "Now let me be equally clear. You will not take my home through threats, intimidation, or force. Any attempt to do so will be met with whatever level of resistance necessary." Thornton assessed her for a long moment, rain cascading from his shoulders as he stood at the bottom of the porch steps. "You present a unique challenge, Ms. Shepherd. Most civilians lack your preparation. But that doesn't change the fundamental equation. You are one person against an organization with virtually unlimited resources." "Numbers and resources aren't always decisive," Catherine responded, "as I'm sure someone with your background understands." A grim smile touched Thornton's lips. "Perhaps, but they certainly affect the calculus of acceptable losses." He glanced at his watch, then back to Catherine. "I'll offer one final opportunity. $1 million, cash transaction completed today. You can be on your way to a new life by nightfall, with financial security most people only dream of." The sum was staggering, far beyond Black Pine's previous offers and well above any reasonable market valuation of her property. The scale of the increase revealed just how valuable the mineral deposits must be, and how urgently Thornton needed to secure the land before federal authorities became involved. "My answer remains no," Catherine said firmly. "My home is not for sale." Thornton nodded once, as though her refusal merely confirmed a conclusion he had already reached. "As you wish." He turned to leave, then paused, looking back over his shoulder. "For what it's worth, I respect your conviction, misguided. Though it may be." "Save your respect," Catherine replied. "Just take your men and leave my property." As Thornton walked away through the steady rainfall, Catherine maintained her vigilant position, the shotgun still ready but not raised. She watched through narrowed eyes as he rejoined Garrett and Cahill at the black SUV parked at the entrance to her access road. Through her security tablet, she observed their brief conference before all three men entered the vehicle. The SUV's engine started, its headlights cutting through the grey curtain of rain. For a moment, Catherine allowed herself to consider the possibility that they were actually departing, that her show of preparedness and knowledge had convinced Thornton to seek an alternate approach. That hope died as the SUV backed up and turned, not toward the main road that would take them back to Millerville, but onto a narrow logging track that circled around the eastern boundary of her property. They weren't leaving. They were repositioning. Catherine closed and secured the cabin door, moving swiftly to check her security feeds. The tablet showed the SUV proceeding along the logging track until it disappeared beyond the range of her outermost camera. Based on the road's trajectory, she calculated they were establishing a position on the eastern ridge, likely to observe her property while formulating a revised approach. "They're adjusting their strategy," she murmured to Ranger, who remained alert despite the apparent departure of the immediate threat. "The FBI timeline is forcing their hand, but they're not giving up." Catherine's assessment of Thornton had solidified during their conversation. He was a corporate operative accustomed to removing obstacles through whatever means necessary, viewing resistance as a problem to be solved rather than a right to be respected. His final offer, extraordinary in its amount, represented his preferred solution: simple financial leverage. With that option rejected, he would proceed to alternatives with cold efficiency. The question was what form those alternatives would take. Direct assault seemed unlikely, given Catherine's demonstrated preparedness and the approaching federal involvement. More probable was some form of staged incident, something that would appear accidental while achieving Clearwater's objective of securing her property. Catherine moved methodically through the cabin, checking her defensive preparations while formulating scenarios based on Thornton's likely approaches. The most concerning realization was that time now worked against her. With FBI agents expected by 2 p.m., Thornton had a narrowing window in which to act. Desperation within a compressed timeline increased the risk of extreme measures. She checked her watch. 12:17 p.m. Less than 2 hours until potential reinforcement arrived, assuming Thompson's timeline was accurate and no delays occurred. 2 hours in which to maintain her defenses against opponents whose resources and determination had been made abundantly clear. A soft chime from the security tablet drew Catherine's attention. The westernmost camera had detected movement, not along the access road or logging track, but through the dense forest that bordered that side of her property. She studied the footage carefully, noting that the figure moved with tactical precision from cover to cover, minimizing exposure while advancing steadily toward the cabin. The rain and distance made identification difficult, but the movement pattern suggested Cahill rather than Garrett or Thornton. His approach angle indicated he was establishing a position that would give him visual coverage of the space between the cabin and the storage shed, a potential vulnerability in her defensive perimeter. Catherine weighed her options. Confronting Cahill directly would reveal that she had detected his movement, potentially sacrificing the advantage of surveillance. Allowing him to establish his position would provide him tactical information about her property's layout, but might also create an opportunity to better understand their revised strategy. She decided on a third option, one that leveraged Ranger's specialized capabilities while maintaining her own position of strength. Catherine subvocalized through the throat microphone, "Ranger Recon Protocol Alpha, track and observe only." The German Shepherd responded immediately, moving to the rear door of the cabin where a specialized dog access had been built into the structure. Unlike a conventional pet door, this entry point had been designed with tactical considerations: silent operation, minimal profile, and specific dimensions for Ranger's size. Catherine opened the reinforced panel, allowing Ranger to slip out into the rainy afternoon. To an observer, it might appear she was simply letting her dog out for a necessary break despite the weather. The reality was a precisely coordinated counter-surveillance operation, with Ranger moving on a predetermined route that would allow him to track Cahill's movements while remaining undetected. Through the throat microphone, Catherine could hear the subtle sounds of Ranger's progress, the soft compression of wet leaves beneath his paws, the gentle parting of underbrush, the controlled rhythm of his breathing as he moved with the silent efficiency that distinguished military working dogs from their civilian counterparts. Years of training had prepared him for exactly this type of operation, moving undetected through difficult terrain while maintaining awareness of both target and handler. Catherine monitored both Ranger's progress through the audio feed and Cahill's movement via the security tablet. The distance between them gradually decreased as Ranger circled behind Cahill's approach vector, establishing a position that would allow him to observe without being detected. What Cahill couldn't know was that Catherine's connection to Ranger went beyond standard handler protocols. Daniel had insisted on training both of them in advanced techniques normally reserved for specialized military units, including adaptive reconnaissance, where the dog operated semi-autonomously based on general directives rather than specific commands. This capability allowed Ranger to make tactical decisions in the field while maintaining the overall mission parameters Catherine established. Through the earpiece, Catherine heard the subtle change in Ranger's breathing that indicated he had established visual contact with his target. The audio feed captured fragments of movement. Cahill, establishing a concealed observation position approximately 90 yards from the western side of the cabin. Close enough for surveillance, but still outside the immediate perimeter where Catherine's more obvious security measures were concentrated. For several minutes, this strange tableau held, Cahill observing the cabin while unknowingly being observed himself by Ranger, with Catherine monitoring both through technology that connected her to her canine partner despite their physical separation. It was exactly the kind of asymmetric advantage that specialized forces relied upon when confronting numerically superior opponents. A new notification on the security tablet shifted Catherine's attention. Movement detected on the eastern approach, where the logging road provided access to her property from the direction opposite Cahill's position. The camera showed Garrett advancing along this route, employing the same tactical movement techniques as his colleague, but approaching from the opposite vector. The strategy became clear. Thornton was establishing a two-pronged surveillance position, with his operators monitoring both primary approaches to the cabin. Standard procedure for preparing a coordinated action against a fixed position. What remained unclear was Thornton's own location. The security feeds showed no sign of the Black Pine executive, suggesting he had either remained with the vehicle or established a command position beyond the range of Catherine's cameras. As Catherine processed this tactical situation, her satellite phone vibrated with an incoming message. She checked it quickly, finding a text from Sheriff Thompson. FBI delayed by weather. ETA now 16:30 or later. Stay secure. Deputy en route to your location. The revised timeline extended her vulnerability window by at least 2 additional hours. More than enough time for Thornton to implement whatever plan he was developing. More concerning was the mention of Thompson sending a deputy. While the intention was clearly supportive, introducing another person into the increasingly volatile situation around her property created additional variables and potential complications. Catherine sent a brief acknowledgement to Thompson, then returned her focus to the developing tactical picture. With Cahill and Garrett establishing observation positions on opposite sides of her property, the most likely next phase would be some form of coordinated approach once they had gathered sufficient intelligence about her security measures and movement patterns. The rain continued unabated, reducing visibility and masking sounds that might otherwise provide early warning of approach. Catherine adjusted her defensive preparations accordingly, focusing on measures that would remain effective despite the weather conditions. Through the throat microphone, she issued new instructions to Ranger. Maintain position, alert on approach, or weapon deployment. The German Shepherd's breathing pattern changed slightly in acknowledgement, settling into the measured rhythm of extended surveillance mode. As Catherine completed her adjustments to the cabin's defenses, a new sound penetrated the steady drumming of rain on the roof, the distinctive rhythm of a vehicle approaching along the main access road. Too soon for the deputy Thompson had mentioned, and moving too quickly for someone navigating the rain-slick road with appropriate caution. The security tablet confirmed her concern. A different vehicle was approaching, not the black SUV Thornton's team had arrived in, but a mud-spattered pickup truck Catherine recognized immediately. Frank Miller's truck was coming up her drive at a speed that suggested urgency rather than a casual visit. This unexpected development created an immediate tactical problem. Miller's arrival introduced a civilian into what had developed into an increasingly militarized confrontation. Whether he came as neighbor or unwitting pawn in Thornton's revised strategy, his presence complicated Catherine's defensive posture significantly. She issued a quick command to Ranger through the throat. Microphone, hold position. Civilian approaching. Then she moved to the front window, watching as Miller's truck skidded slightly on the wet gravel before coming to a stop in front of her cabin. The elderly rancher emerged from the cab with uncharacteristic haste, hunched against the rain as he hurried toward her porch. His expression carried an urgency that instantly raised Catherine's alert level. This wasn't a social call or even a follow-up to their previous conversation. Catherine opened the door cautiously, maintaining tactical awareness while acknowledging her neighbor. "Frank? What's wrong?" Miller's weathered face was tight with concern, rain streaming from the brim of his Stetson as he spoke. "Catherine, you need to clear out. Now. Overheard those Black Pine fellas at the diner before they headed. Up here, they're not just talking about pressure tactics anymore." "What did you hear exactly?" Catherine asked, her focus sharpening. "That Thornton guy was on the phone with someone, talking about asset denial protocols and acceptable collateral circumstances. Said something about electrical systems in older cabins being unreliable, especially during storms." Miller's expression darkened further. Then he mentioned insurance investigators not looking too closely at fire causes in remote locations during bad weather. The implications were immediately clear to Catherine. Thornton had moved from intimidation to planning destruction of her property, likely with her inside it. A cabin fire during a heavy rainstorm would appear suspicious to trained investigators, but could be plausibly attributed to electrical failure if staged properly, especially if evidence was destroyed in the blaze. "You need to get somewhere safe," Miller continued urgently. "Martha and I can put you up until this blows over. These aren't people to mess with, Catherine." Before she could respond, Catherine's attention was drawn to a subtle change in Ranger's breathing pattern through the earpiece. The distinctive shift that indicated he had detected new movement in his surveillance sector. A moment later, the security tablet chimed with multiple simultaneous alerts from different cameras. The tactical situation was changing rapidly, with new threats developing on multiple fronts simultaneously. Miller's warning, Ranger's alert, and the security systems notifications created a convergence that demanded immediate decision-making. "Frank, you need to leave," Catherine said firmly, her tone brooking no argument. "Get back to your ranch and stay there. Call Sheriff Thompson and tell him exactly what you heard." Miller hesitated, clearly torn between concern for his neighbor and recognition of her resolute demeanor. "Catherine, I can't just—" "Yes, you can," she interrupted. "This isn't your fight, Frank. The best help you can provide is getting that information to the sheriff." Something in her expression must have convinced him. Miller nodded reluctantly, turning back toward his truck with a final concerned glance over his shoulder. "You be careful, you hear? These men don't play by any rules decent folks would recognize." As Miller's truck pulled away, Catherine returned her full attention to the security tablet. The alerts painted a disturbing picture. Garrett was now moving directly toward the cabin from the east, while Cahill maintained his observation position to the west. Most concerning was the new movement detected at the northern periphery of her property. A third figure approaching through the forest with deliberate purpose. Thornton had abandoned negotiation entirely. The operation had shifted from surveillance to direct action, with a coordinated three-pronged approach that suggested they were no longer concerned about maintaining deniability. Miller's warning about fire as their intended method aligned with the accelerated timeline, destruction of property that would eliminate both Catherine's residence and any evidence of their involvement. The rain had intensified further, sheets of water now reducing visibility to mere yards beyond the cabin's windows. Lightning flashed in the distance, followed seconds later by the rumble of thunder moving closer across the valley. The storm was providing perfect cover for their approach, while potentially hampering the arrival of the deputy Thompson had dispatched. Catherine subvocalized through the throat microphone. "Ranger, defensive protocol engaged. Return to the primary position." The German Shepherd would understand the command, disengaging from surveillance mode and returning to the cabin via the pre-established route they had practiced during countless training sessions. As she prepared to meet the converging threat, Catherine's thoughts briefly touched on the irony of the situation. Thornton and his men had initially targeted her property, believing an isolated widow with a dog would present minimal resistance to their acquisition plans. That fundamental misunderstanding, the failure to recognize that both the widow and her dog possessed capabilities far beyond civilian norms, had led them to a confrontation they had never anticipated. In their arrogance, they had taunted what they perceived as a simple pet, unaware that Ranger had been trained from his earliest days to respond to threats with precisely controlled but potentially lethal force. The specialized command that Catherine had hoped never to use under real circumstances now rested at the forefront of her mind, a final option if other measures failed. Lightning flashed again, closer now, momentarily illuminating the rain-drenched clearing around the cabin in stark relief. In that brief electric moment, Catherine caught a glimpse of Garrett's approach from the east, no longer attempting concealment, but advancing with direct purpose toward her home. The storm had arrived in full force, both the natural tempest that lashed the valley with wind and rain, and the human conflict that had been building since Thornton's men first appeared on her property. As thunder rolled across Hollow Creek, Catherine made her final defensive preparations, ready to protect what was hers against men who had gravely underestimated what it meant to threaten a widow who had nothing left to lose but her home, and a dog trained to defend it to the death. Thunder crashed overhead as Catherine secured the front door, her mind calculating timing and distances. Garrett's approach from the east was the most immediate concern, his direct advance suggesting he would reach the cabin within minutes. The third figure to the north, likely Thornton himself based on Miller's warning, was moving more cautiously but with clear purpose toward her position. Ranger would need approximately 3 minutes to return from his surveillance position near Cahill, assuming he maintained the disciplined pace their training had established for covert movement. Catherine checked her watch, mentally mapping the converging threats against her defensive options. Lightning flashed again, briefly illuminating the cabin interior with stark white light. At that moment, Catherine made her decision. Rather than waiting for Thornton's team to execute whatever plan they had developed, she would disrupt their coordination by engaging on her terms. Moving swiftly to the rear of the cabin, Catherine retrieved her handgun from its secured position and checked the loaded magazine. Unlike the shotgun, which served primarily as a visible deterrent, the 9mm was her preferred tactical option, more precise and manageable in close quarters if the situation deteriorated to direct engagement. The security tablet showed Garrett now less than 40 yards from the eastern side of the cabin, moving with purpose through the driving rain. His right hand held something Catherine couldn't clearly identify in the low-resolution feed, but his posture suggested readiness to use whatever tool or weapon he carried. Catherine positioned herself near the kitchen window that offered the best vantage of the eastern approach while providing partial cover. Through the throat microphone, she detected Ranger's approach to the cabin's rear entrance. Right on schedule, his movements precisely calibrated despite the challenging conditions outside. A soft double click in her earpiece confirmed Ranger had reached the rear door. Catherine activated the release mechanism that allowed him entry, and moments later felt the reassuring presence of the German Shepherd at her side. His fur damp from the rain, but his alertness undiminished. "Good boy," she murmured, briefly touching his head while maintaining visual contact with the approaching threat. Ranger's body pressed against her leg, communicating his readiness more effectively than words could have. Through the rain-streaked window, Catherine caught glimpses of Garrett's advance, tactical movement from cover to cover, utilizing the trees and outbuildings to minimize his exposure. Not the approach of someone coming to negotiate or even intimidate, but the careful advance of an operator preparing for direct action. Catherine decided to alter the engagement parameters, disrupting whatever coordinated plan Thornton had established. She activated the cabin's external speaker system once more. "Mr. Garrett, you're trespassing on private property during severe weather conditions. Sheriff Thompson has been notified of your presence and your colleagues' positions." The announcement had its intended effect. Garrett froze momentarily, clearly surprised by the explicit acknowledgement of his approach. Through the security feed, Catherine observed similar reactions from the other intruders, Cahill shifting his position as though reassessing his concealment, the third figure to the north pausing in mid-advance. Lightning split the sky again, thunder following almost immediately. The storm now directly overhead, sheets of rain reducing visibility to mere yards beyond the windows. Catherine used these conditions to her advantage, activating the cabin's external floodlights sequentially rather than simultaneously, creating momentary blind spots and destroying night vision adaptation for anyone looking toward the suddenly illuminated areas. "Final warning," she continued through the speaker system. "Leave my property immediately or face consequences." Garrett had recovered from his initial surprise, now moving with renewed purpose toward the cabin's eastern side. Whatever Thornton had communicated through their tactical network had apparently reinforced his resolve, despite Catherine's warning. The security tablet provided the explanation. The figure approaching from the north had accelerated his advance, no longer attempting concealment, but moving directly toward the cabin with urgent purpose. Catherine recognized Thornton's gait even through the rain-blurred camera feed. He carried something in his hands, a rectangular object held with obvious care despite his rapid movement. Miller's warning echoed in Catherine's mind. Electrical systems in older cabins and fire causes in remote locations. The object Thornton carried was almost certainly an incendiary device, something that would create a fire sufficiently destructive to eliminate both Catherine's residence and any evidence of their involvement. The tactical situation had shifted from potential confrontation to imminent threat. These men were no longer attempting to intimidate or pressure. They had committed to destroying her property, with her inside it, a desperate measure accelerated by the approaching federal investigation and Catherine's stubborn refusal to capitulate. Catherine. Subvocalize through the throat microphone. Ranger, defensive engagement protocol, East threat prioritized. The German Shepherd responded immediately, moving to the position they had established during countless training sessions, a concealed vantage near the front door where he could deploy instantly when commanded. Lightning illuminated the clearing again, just as Garrett reached the edge of the cabin's front porch. Unlike his previous approach, he now moved with aggressive purpose, his hand clearly visible holding what appeared to be a compact crowbar or pry tool, likely intended to force entry through a window or door. Catherine had anticipated this possibility, her defensive preparations including reinforced entry points that would require significant time and effort to breach. What Garrett couldn't know was that these reinforcements weren't designed solely to keep intruders out, but to channel their entry attempts toward specific predetermined points where Catherine maintained tactical advantage. As Garrett tested the eastern window frame with his pry tool, finding it unexpectedly resistant, Catherine moved silently through the cabin to reposition near the front door where Ranger waited. Through the security tablet she carried, she tracked Thornton's continued advance from the north, now less than 60 yards from the cabin, and still carrying the suspected incendiary device. Cahill's position remained concerning. The security feed showed him moving tactically around the western perimeter, likely seeking entry points more vulnerable than those Garrett was attempting to breach. His background with military working dogs made him particularly dangerous, as he might anticipate standard deployment protocols for canine assets. The moment of decision arrived as Garrett abandoned subtlety and began applying force to the reinforced window frame, the metal tool in his hands striking the wood with increasing intensity. Each impact reverberated through the cabin, despite the thunderstorm raging outside. Catherine had prepared for exactly this scenario, not merely defensive positioning, but a response protocol that would disrupt the coordinated attack before it fully developed. She activated a pre-positioned device on the cabin's eastern exterior, not a weapon, but a tactical disorientation system that Daniel had adapted from military technology, the sudden eruption of blinding light and disorienting sound from directly beside Garrett's position had the intended effect. He recoiled instinctively, dropping the pry tool as he raised his hands to shield his eyes from the strobing light pattern specifically designed to trigger temporary sensory confusion. Catherine used this momentary advantage to implement the next phase of her defensive plan. Through the throat microphone, she issued the command that shifted their posture from defensive to active engagement. Ranger, disarm protocol east target. The German Shepherd moved with explosive speed, hitting the front door release mechanism with his weight and bursting through the opening before Garrett could recover from the disorientation effect. In the driving rain, illuminated by the cabin's floodlights and the intermittent lightning, Ranger was a blur of focused aggression, 85 pounds of precisely trained muscle and instinct targeting the immediate threat with surgical precision. Unlike a conventional attack dog, Ranger had been trained in specialized disarmament techniques, targeting limbs and weapons rather than inflicting maximum damage. He hit Garrett's right arm with calculated force, powerful jaws clamping around the forearm that held the pry tool rather than going for more vulnerable areas. The impact and sudden pain drove Garrett to his knees despite his own combat training. His shout of alarm and pain cut through the storm's rumble, a sound that would alert his colleagues to the engagement, but also confirm that their coordinated approach had been disrupted. Catherine moved to the doorway, weapon ready but not, yet engaging directly. "Call him off or he takes the arm," she warned, her voice carrying the absolute certainty that comes from complete confidence in one's capabilities. Garrett's face reflected the pain and shock of his situation. A professional operator suddenly finding himself neutralized by what he had likely dismissed as a pet rather than a specialized tactical asset. "Call off your fucking dog," he gasped, trying unsuccessfully to break free from Ranger's grip. "Not until your colleagues stand down," Catherine replied evenly. Through the security tablet, she could see Thornton had halted his advance at the sound of Garrett's shout, while Cahill was moving with increased urgency around the western perimeter, likely attempting to flank her position and assist his compromised teammate. Ranger maintained his grip with disciplined pressure, sufficient to immobilize and cause significant pain, but calibrated to avoid severing major blood vessels or causing permanent damage unless commanded to escalate. The specialized bite technique was one few civilians would recognize, but that military handlers would immediately identify as advanced tactical training. "Thompson!" Garrett shouted through gritted teeth, using what appeared to be Thornton's first name rather than his surname. "She's got advanced assets, military grade." The reference to assets, rather than simply saying, "her dog attacked me," confirmed Catherine's assessment of these men. They operated with the terminology and mindset of private military contractors, viewing everything through the lens of tactical advantage rather than civilian interaction. Through the security feed, Catherine observed Thornton's response to this new development. Rather than abandoning his approach, he adjusted his route, using the distraction Garrett had inadvertently provided to advance toward the north side of the cabin, where Catherine's attention might be divided. "Your boss is still approaching with what appears to be an incendiary device," Catherine called to Garrett, maintaining her position of advantage in the doorway. "Tell him to drop it and back away, or this situation escalates beyond your current discomfort." Garrett's eyes widened slightly, surprised that she was tracking Thornton's movements despite the confrontation at her doorstep. He keyed his throat, microphone with his free hand, speaking urgently. "Thompson, abort approach. She has surveillance coverage and tactical awareness." Through the rain, Catherine could see Thornton hesitate, clearly reassessing based on this new information. The rectangular object remained in his hands, but his advance had stalled approximately 40 yards from the cabin's northern side. The tactical situation had reached a critical juncture. Catherine had disrupted their coordinated approach and neutralized one operator, but Cahill remained unaccounted for in her direct line of sight, and Thornton still posed a threat with the suspected incendiary device. Lightning flashed again, followed immediately by a deafening thunderclap that momentarily masked all other sounds. In that instant of natural chaos, Catherine detected movement at the edge of her peripheral vision. Cahill emerging from the western side of the property at a dead run, something metallic gleaming in his hand despite the poor visibility. Catherine reacted instinctively, shifting her position to address this new threat while maintaining awareness of both Garrett and Thornton. "Ranger, maintain hold. Secondary threat west," she subvocalized through the throat microphone, knowing the German Shepherd would continue immobilizing Garrett while she dealt with the new development. Cahill's approach was professional but desperate. A tactical rush clearly intended to overwhelm her position before she could effectively respond. The object in his hand became identifiable as he closed the distance. Not a conventional firearm, but a tactical taser, a less lethal option that suggested they still hoped to neutralize rather than eliminate her directly. Catherine raised her weapon to a ready position without immediately engaging. "Stop where you are, Cahill!" she shouted over the storm's fury. "Next step and I will fire!" Unlike Garrett, who had underestimated both Catherine and Ranger, Cahill showed no surprise at her tactical positioning or command presence. His military, Background had likely prepared him to recognize the signs of professional training, and his specialty with working dogs gave him insight into the capabilities Ranger was demonstrating. "You won't shoot," he called back, continuing his advance, though at a slightly reduced pace. "Your background check shows no combat deployments, Mrs. Shepherd. Pulling a trigger is different from training for it." The psychological tactic was well applied, attempting to create doubt about her willingness to use lethal force while continuing to close the distance where his taser would become effective. What Cahill couldn't know was that Catherine's training with Daniel had included extensive live fire exercises and scenario-based conditioning specifically designed to overcome the natural hesitation most civilians experience. "Final warning," Catherine responded, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. To emphasize her resolve, she fired a single round into the ground several feet in front of Cahill's advance, a demonstration of both willingness to discharge her weapon and the accuracy with which she could place shots, even in adverse conditions. The impact kicked up a splash of mud and water directly in Cahill's path, forcing him to break stride momentarily. His expression shifted from determined advance to tactical reassessment as he recognized that Catherine's capabilities extended beyond defense to potentially lethal engagement if pushed further. "You're making a mistake," he called. His advance halted, but his posture still suggesting readiness to resume if an opening presented itself. "This property will be secured today one way or another. How it happens is up to you. My property, my terms," Catherine replied, maintaining her firing position with unwavering discipline. "And my terms are simple. All of you leave immediately, or this situation becomes significantly worse for everyone involved." Through the security tablet, held in her non-dominant hand, Catherine tracked Thornton's position, noting that he had begun a careful withdrawal toward the tree line with the rectangular object still in his possession. The device's nature remained concerning if it was indeed an incendiary mechanism designed to destroy her cabin. Its presence constituted a continuing threat, even as the direct confrontation unfolded. Garrett remained immobilized by Ranger's disciplined hold, his initial struggles having subsided as he recognized the futility of resistance against the specialized bite technique. Blood mixed with rainwater on his sleeve, where Ranger's teeth maintained their precise pressure, but the controlled application prevented the kind of damage that might have resulted from a conventional canine attack. Thompson's pulling back, Cahill observed, his gaze shifting briefly toward the northern perimeter, where Thornton was indeed retreating toward the forest edge. "What did you do? Who did you contact?" The question revealed a crucial insight. These men had operated on the assumption that Catherine was isolated with limited resources and connections. The coordinated defense she had mounted, coupled with her explicit knowledge of their backgrounds and methods, had disrupted that fundamental assessment. Now they were recalculating, uncertain of what additional resources or assistance she might have activated. "Let's just say you're not the only ones with connections to specialized resources," Catherine replied, allowing deliberate ambiguity to enhance their uncertainty. "Federal agents are already en route to this location. How do you think that will play out for Clearwater Strategic Resources if they arrive to find an armed assault in progress?" The mention of their parent company by name, coupled with the reference to federal intervention, clearly impacted Cahill's tactical calculations. His expression hardened, but Catherine could see the professional assessment taking place behind his eyes, weighing operational objectives against escalating risk factors. "Garrett needs medical attention," Cahill said finally, gesturing toward his colleague still held in Ranger's grip. "Call off your dog, and we'll withdraw to reassess." "Withdraw first," Catherine countered, maintaining her advantageous position. "Once you're clear of my property line, I'll release him. The standoff stretched for several tense seconds, rain cascading between them as Cahill weighed his options. Finally, he lowered the taser and took a deliberate step backward. "Thompson," he spoke into his throat microphone. "Tactical withdrawal advised. Situation parameters exceeded operational guidelines." Through the security feed, Catherine observed Thornton's response, a brief hesitation, followed by a gesture of acknowledgement before he continued his retreat toward the forest edge. The rectangular device remained in his possession. A detail, Catherine noted with continued concern. "We're withdrawing," Cahill announced, taking another step back while maintaining eye contact with Catherine. "But this isn't over. Clearwater doesn't abandon high-value acquisitions because of initial complications." "Then Clearwater needs better intelligence about the complications they're facing," Catherine replied evenly. As Cahill continued his deliberate retreat, she maintained her firing position, unwilling to surrender tactical advantage until the withdrawal was confirmed through her security feeds. When both Cahill and Thornton had reached the tree line, Catherine addressed Garrett, who remained immobilized by Ranger's controlled grip. "When I release you, you will walk, not run, directly to join your colleagues. Any deviation from that path, any gesture that could be interpreted as hostile, and Ranger will re-engage with significantly less restraint. Do you understand?" Garrett nodded, pain and humiliation evident in his expression. "I understand." Catherine sub-vocalized the release command through the throat microphone. "Ranger, disengage and return." The German Shepherd immediately released his grip on Garrett's arm and backed away in a controlled movement, maintaining vigilant attention on the neutralized threat while creating distance. Garrett slowly regained his feet, clutching his injured arm against his body. Blood seeped through his rain-soaked sleeve, but the controlled nature of Ranger's bite technique had prevented the kind of catastrophic damage a full attack would have inflicted. He glanced briefly at Catherine, then at Ranger, a new respect evident in his assessment. "You're not what we expected," he said simply, before turning and walking stiffly toward the tree line where his colleagues waited. Catherine maintained her vigilant position until all three men had disappeared into the forest, their withdrawal confirmed through multiple security feeds. Only then did she lower her weapon slightly, though her alert status remained elevated. Tactical retreat did not necessarily signal abandonment of their objective. Ranger returned to her side, his disciplined performance transitioning seamlessly back to vigilant companion mode without requiring explicit commands. Catherine briefly rested her free hand on his damp fur, acknowledging his flawless execution of their defensive protocols. "Good work," she murmured, feeling the solid warmth of his body against her leg, a reassuring presence in the aftermath of the confrontation. The immediate threat had been neutralized, but Catherine harbored no illusions about the situation's resolution. Thornton's continued possession of the suspected incendiary device, coupled with Cahill's explicit statement that Clearwater wouldn't abandon their acquisition plans, suggested they were retreating to reformulate rather than withdrawing permanently. Lightning flickered more distantly now, the storm beginning to move beyond Hollow Creek Valley as Catherine scanned the forest edge where the Black Pine team had disappeared. The tactical confrontation had demonstrated her capabilities and disrupted their initial approach, but the fundamental conflict remained unresolved. Catherine checked her watch, 1:42 p.m. The FBI agents Thompson had contacted were still potentially hours away given the weather delays. The window of vulnerability remained, though Thornton and his team would now approach with considerably more caution, given their new assessment of the defenses they faced. Moving back inside the cabin, Catherine secured the door and performed a swift check of all entry points, confirming none had been compromised during the confrontation. Ranger maintained his vigilant patrol of the interior perimeter, his demeanor clearly communicating continued tactical alertness despite the apparent withdrawal of the immediate threat. The security tablet showed the Black Pine team regrouping. At their vehicle on the logging road, a hushed but intense conversation taking place beneath the minimal shelter offered by the surrounding pine trees. Catherine wished she could hear their discussion. Tactical reassessment would reveal much about their next potential move. Her satellite phone vibrated with an incoming message from Sheriff Thompson. "Deputy Morales, 10 minutes from your location. FBI update, still delayed by road conditions. Stay secure." The approaching deputy represented both assistance and complication. Another person on site would provide additional defensive capability, but also created a potential vulnerability. If Thornton's team decided to escalate further, law enforcement officers, even those with military backgrounds like many rural deputies, rarely had training equivalent to the specialized capabilities Catherine and Ranger had demonstrated. Catherine sent a brief acknowledgement to Thompson, then prepared for the deputy's arrival by gathering documentation she had compiled on Black Pine's true nature and intentions. When law enforcement became directly involved, evidence would become crucial to shifting the confrontation from personal property defense to potential criminal prosecution. As she organized these materials, Catherine's mind processed the tactical lessons from the brief but intense engagement. Thornton's team had operated with professional coordination but had fundamentally underestimated both her preparedness and Ranger's capabilities. That error had created the opening she exploited to disrupt their approach, but they would not make the same mistake twice. Most concerning was the nature of the device Thornton carried, likely an incendiary mechanism that could still pose a significant threat to her property if deployed effectively. The retreat might simply represent a strategic repositioning rather than abandonment of their objective. Through the throat microphone, Catherine detected Ranger's subtle alert, a change in breathing pattern that indicated he had sensed something beyond the cabin walls. She moved immediately to the security tablet, checking the feeds for any sign of renewed approach. The cameras showed no human movement, but captured something potentially more concerning. Thornton at the vehicle, removing items from what appeared to be a specialized case in the rear compartment. Though distance and weather conditions obscured the details, the methodical nature of his actions suggested preparation of equipment rather than packing for departure. Catherine's tactical assessment crystallized into certainty. This confrontation was far from over. Thornton's team had retreated to reassess and retool, but their fundamental objective remained unchanged. The property would be secured by whatever means necessary before federal authorities could interrupt their operation. As Deputy Morales's vehicle appeared on the furthest security feed, approaching along the main access road with cautious speed, given the treacherous conditions, Catherine prepared for the next phase of what had become a tactical chess match with potentially lethal stakes. The deputy's arrival would alter the dynamics once again, introducing official law enforcement into a situation that had already escalated beyond conventional property disputes. The rain continued to fall, though with diminishing intensity as the storm moved eastward across the valley. Ranger maintained his vigilant posture at Catherine's side, both of them watching the security feeds with focused attention as the situation continued to evolve. Their successful defense had bought valuable time and demonstrated capabilities that would force Thornton's team to reconsider their approach. But Catherine harbored no illusions about the reprieve's temporary nature. Men like Thornton, backed by corporations like Clearwater Strategic Resources, didn't abandon high-value objectives because of initial setbacks. They adjusted, adapted, and returned with refined tactics based on improved intelligence. The next, Encounter would be determined by which side better utilized the lessons from this initial engagement, and whether federal reinforcements would arrive before Thornton implemented whatever contingency plan he was now preparing beside the mud-spattered SUV at the edge of Catherine's property. Deputy Carmen Morales navigated the rain-slicked access road with the careful precision of someone well acquainted with treacherous mountain conditions. Her patrol vehicle, a county-issue SUV with reinforced undercarriage and all-terrain capability, crawled steadily toward Catherine's cabin through the diminishing rainfall. Catherine observed the deputy's approach through her security feeds, noting the methodical way Morales scanned her surroundings even while driving, a habit that suggested prior tactical training beyond standard law enforcement protocols. Sheriff Thompson had chosen his representative wisely. Deputy approaching, Catherine subvocalized to Ranger through the throat microphone. Friendly contact. The German Shepherd acknowledged with a subtle shift in posture, maintaining his alert status but adjusting his threat assessment to accommodate the arrival of an authorized visitor. Catherine moved to the front door, weapon secured but still within immediate reach, as she prepared to greet the deputy. Through the security tablet, she kept one eye on the logging road where Thornton and his team continued their activities beside their vehicle, seemingly unbothered by the deputy's arrival, a detail that heightened her concern about their confidence. Despite the recent tactical setback, Deputy Morales parked her vehicle at a textbook tactical angle, positioned for rapid departure if necessary, while providing maximum cover from the driver's side. She emerged cautiously, one hand resting near her holstered sidearm as her gaze swept the clearing surrounding Catherine's cabin. Though only in her early 30s, Morales carried herself with the poised readiness Catherine recognized from military personnel. Her department-issued uniform was impeccably maintained despite the adverse weather conditions. The utility belt at her waist organized with the particular arrangement of someone who had given careful thought to equipment accessibility. In crisis situations, Miss Shepherd, Morales called as she approached the porch, her voice carrying the professional neutrality of law enforcement while her eyes continued their environmental assessment. Deputy Carmen Morales, Sheriff Thompson sent me to check on your situation. Catherine opened the door, keeping her position partially shielded by the doorframe, a habit Daniel had instilled that she maintained even with apparently friendly contacts. Deputy, thank you for coming, especially in these conditions. Morales nodded, climbing the porch steps with measured movements. Her gaze shifted briefly to Ranger, who had positioned himself beside Catherine in a calm but vigilant posture. Sheriff mentioned there's been trouble with Black Pine development representatives. Said they've escalated beyond normal business pressure tactics. That's putting it mildly, Catherine replied, stepping back to allow the deputy entry. They just attempted a coordinated three-point approach to my property while carrying what appeared to be an incendiary device. Morales' expression sharpened, her professional demeanor intensifying with this information. You've had direct confrontation, then? Any injuries? One of their operatives sustained a defensive bite from my dog when he attempted forced entry, Catherine explained, gesturing toward the security tablet she held. I have documentation of the entire encounter through my security system. The deputy's eyebrows rose slightly at the mention of security systems, clearly not expecting such technological preparations in a remote cabin. Her gaze shifted again, to Ranger this time with more focused assessment. That's not just a pet, is he? Military working dog. He was my husband's partner during his final deployment, Catherine confirmed, appreciating the deputy's perceptive observation. Daniel trained us both before his death. Understanding flashed across Morales' features, not just of Ranger's capabilities, but of the broader tactical situation she had entered. Sheriff mentioned your husband was in the Special Forces, said I should be prepared for a non-standard civilian scenario. Catherine nodded, gesturing toward the kitchen table where she had arranged the documentation on black pine and Clearwater strategic resources. Let me bring you up to speed on exactly what we're dealing with. For the next several minutes, Catherine provided a concise briefing on the situation, Black Pine's true nature as a Clearwater shell company, their interest in the mineral deposits beneath her property, and the escalating tactics that had culminated in today's attempted incursion. Throughout, Deputy Morales took notes with focused efficiency, occasionally asking clarifying questions that revealed her own background. Military police, 4 years before joining the Sheriff's Department, Morales explained when Catherine commented on her tactical awareness. Served in Afghanistan during the same period as your husband, though in different operational areas. This shared connection to military service established an immediate professional rapport between them. Catherine showed Morales the security feeds, including footage of the recent confrontation and the current position of Thornton's team at the logging road. They're still on your property, Morales observed, her tone hardening with professional disapproval. After a direct warning and physical confrontation, that's well beyond trespassing at this point. I don't believe they've abandoned their objective, Catherine replied, directing the deputy's attention to Thornton's activities beside the vehicle. They're regrouping, likely preparing a different approach now that their initial assessment of the situation has proven inaccurate. Morales studied the feed with narrowed eyes. That case he's working from, specialized equipment container, probably custom foam inserts for specific tools or devices. Her law enforcement perspective added valuable insight to Catherine's own tactical assessment. Sheriff's trying to get FBI assets here as quickly as possible, but the storm has washed out sections of the main highway from Preston. I'm aware, Catherine said, checking the time, nearly 2:15 p.m. The delay works in their favor. Thornton seems determined to secure this property before federal authorities can intervene. Morales turned from the security feed, her expression reflecting the professional calculation of a tactical situation. Miss Shepherd, I need to be clear about jurisdictional parameters here. I'm authorized to protect civilians and respond to criminal activity, but given your specialized background and the nature of these intruders, I want to establish clear, operational guidelines. The question beneath her statement was evident. Morales was asking whether Catherine expected conventional law enforcement response or support for her own defensive protocols. It was a level of professional courtesy rarely extended to civilians. But Catherine's demonstrated capabilities and documentation clearly placed this situation outside normal parameters. My priority is protecting my property while avoiding lethal escalation if possible, Catherine stated precisely. Ranger has been trained in controlled engagement techniques specifically to neutralize threats without causing permanent damage. I would prefer to maintain that approach unless circumstances force more definitive measures. Morales nodded, appreciating the clarity. Understood. I'll establish a visible law enforcement presence while coordinating with Sheriff Thompson regarding additional resources. The documented trespassing and attempted forced entry gives me clear justification for protective intervention. She paused, then added with professional frankness, though I should note I'm the only available deputy for this quadrant of the county today. The rest of our limited force is dealing with storm-related emergencies. The revelation wasn't surprising, given the rural department's known resource limitations, but it clarified that Morales represented the entirety of conventional law enforcement. Support available in the immediate term. If Thornton's team decided to press their advantage despite the deputy's presence, the tactical mathematics remained challenging. They're moving, Catherine observed, attention returning to the security feed where Thornton's group had finished whatever preparations they had been conducting. The three men had returned to their vehicle, but weren't departing. Instead, they were repositioning it further along the logging road, deeper into Catherine's property, rather than withdrawing. Establishing a forward operating position, Morales assessed, the military terminology coming naturally given the situation's nature. Looks like they're setting up for extended operations rather than immediate action. Catherine agreed with the assessment. Thornton was adapting to the initial setback by shifting to a more deliberate approach, establishing a staging area beyond her cabin's immediate perimeter, but still within operational range of the objective. It was a professional response to unexpected resistance, leveraging their resource advantage for a sustained pressure campaign rather than direct assault. "I'll make contact and issue formal trespassing warnings," Morales stated, checking her department-issued sidearm and adjusting her utility belt. "Get everything documented officially to strengthen the case for when federal authorities arrive." "They're not conventional trespassers," Catherine cautioned. "These are private military contractors with extensive tactical experience. Garrett and Cahill both have combat backgrounds, and Thornton has overseen operations in contested regions internationally." Morales's expression remained professionally composed despite this concerning information. "Appreciated, but I still need to establish the legal framework." The sheriff was explicit about documentation for federal handoff. She gestured toward the security tablet. "May I use your system to monitor my approach? Having overwatch would be tactically advantageous." Catherine nodded, respecting the deputy's procedural requirements while appreciating her tactical awareness. "I'll maintain surveillance coverage. Rangers can be deployed for support if the situation deteriorates." "Let's hope that won't be necessary," Morales replied, though her tone suggested realistic assessment rather than optimism. She unclipped her radio and contacted the Sheriff's Department dispatch. "Morales to dispatch. On scene at Shepherd residence. Confirming trespassers still present on property. Moving to issue formal warnings and documents for record. Request continuous open channel." The dispatcher's acknowledgement crackled through the radio as Morales prepared to engage with Thornton's team. Before departing, she turned to Catherine with a final assessment. "These guys likely have communications monitoring capability. They'll know I've arrived and that I'm operating alone. That changes their risk calculation, but might not deter them if their objective is valuable enough." "The mineral deposits are worth billions, according to my intelligence," Catherine confirmed. "Clearwater has already invested millions in acquiring surrounding properties and conducting geological surveys." Morales absorbed this with a grim nod. "Then they'll conduct a cost-benefit analysis on confronting law enforcement. Be prepared for them to test boundaries rather than immediately withdraw." She checked her equipment one final time. "I'll establish a visual contact while maintaining tactical awareness. If they make threatening moves, I'll withdraw to a defensible position here." As the deputy departed toward her patrol vehicle, Catherine returned her attention to the security feeds, monitoring both Morales's movement and Thornton's team's response to her approach. Ranger remained vigilant at her side, his training allowing him to maintain alert status for extended periods without diminishing effectiveness. Through the tablet, Catherine observed Thornton's immediate reaction to the deputy's vehicle approaching their position. The three men conferred briefly before Thornton stepped forward alone, the others remaining beside their SUV in a posture that appeared casual but maintained tactical readiness. Though the security feed didn't capture audio at this distance, the body language between Morales and Thornton revealed a professional confrontation, the deputy maintaining authoritative posture while Thornton presented a cooperative facade that contradicted his team's continued presence on Catherine's property. "He's stalling," Catherine murmured to Ranger, who tracked her voice with attentive focus, buying time while maintaining deniability for whatever they're planning next. The confrontation between Morales and Thornton continued for several minutes, official warnings being issued, while Thornton appeared to offer explanations that the deputy documented with methodical precision. Eventually, Morales returned to her vehicle and retrieved what appeared to be formal citation paperwork, which she presented to Thornton with the official procedure of law enforcement establishing legal consequences for continued trespassing. Throughout this interaction, Catherine noticed Cahill's continued assessment of the surrounding terrain, his gaze periodically sweeping toward the cabin with tactical evaluation rather than casual observation. His specialized background with military working dogs made him the most dangerous of the three, in terms of anticipating Catherine and Ranger's capabilities. When Morales finally returned to her patrol vehicle and began driving back toward the cabin, Catherine noted that Thornton's team made no immediate move to depart, despite being officially cited. This confirmed her assessment. They were willing to accept legal complications in service of their primary objective. Deputy Morales returned to the cabin with her professional demeanor intact, but concern evident in her expression. "They've been formally cited for criminal trespassing and ordered to vacate the property immediately," she reported as Catherine met her at the door. Thornton claimed they're conducting environmental assessments authorized by the county commission, but couldn't produce documentation when requested. "And yet they're not leaving," Catherine observed, gesturing toward the security feed where the Black Pine team remained in position along the logging road. "No, they're not," Morales confirmed grimly. "Thornton said they would conclude their necessary measurements before departing." When informed that continued presence constituted criminal trespassing and potential arrest, he simply smiled and said he'd address any legal complications through appropriate channels. The response reinforced Catherine's understanding of Clearwater's operational methodology. Legal consequences were simply anticipated costs rather than actual deterrents when substantial financial interests were at stake. "Sheriff Thompson needs to be updated," Catherine said. "Thornton's willingness to accept citations without compliance suggests they're committed to their timeline, regardless of local law enforcement intervention." Morales nodded, keying her radio to provide a situation report to dispatch for relay to the sheriff. As she concluded this communication, her attention was drawn to movement on the security feed. Garrett and Cahill had begun unloading additional equipment from their vehicle, while Thornton appeared to be engaged in a phone conversation. "That's not environmental assessment equipment," Morales observed sharply, studying the items being removed from the SUV's rear compartment. "Those are tactical deployment cases, similar to what SWAT units use for specialized operations." Catherine's concern deepened as she recognized the nature of the equipment being assembled. "They're preparing for nightfall," she assessed. "The storm provided their initial cover, but darkness will offer additional tactical advantages if they're planning another approach." The deputy's expression hardened with professional determination. "Then we use the remaining daylight to strengthen our position and establish clear defensive protocols." She upholstered her department-issued sidearm and checked it with practiced efficiency. "I need to be absolutely clear, Ms. Shepard. If they attempt another incursion, especially with tactical equipment, I'm authorized to employ necessary force to protect civilians and property." "Understood," Catherine replied, appreciating the deputy's direct communication about operational parameters. "My security systems cover approximately 80% of the property perimeter, but have blind spots in the densely forested sections. To the northwest and southeast," Morales nodded, shifting fully into tactical assessment mode. "We should establish supplementary observation points and fallback positions in case they manage to breach the cabin perimeter. Two-person defense with canine support requires careful resource allocation." The professional analysis confirmed Catherine's initial impression. Deputy Morales had extensive tactical training beyond standard law enforcement preparation. Her approach to the developing situation reflected military protocols for defensive operations with limited personnel. Ranger can operate semi-autonomously on predefined patrol routes, Catherine explained, indicating the specialized harness the German Shepherd still wore. His training includes perimeter security and early warning functions without direct handler presence. Impressive, Morales acknowledged. That expands our effective coverage significantly. She moved to the window, studying the terrain surrounding the cabin with tactical consideration. We should establish communication protocols and recognition, signals to prevent confusion during darkness operations. For the next hour, Catherine and Morales developed a coordinated defensive strategy, leveraging their complementary backgrounds and capabilities to maximize effectiveness despite their numerical disadvantage. The deputy's law enforcement perspective combined with Catherine's specialized training created a tactical approach that anticipated Thornton's likely strategies while establishing appropriate countermeasures. Throughout this planning, Catherine maintained surveillance of the Black Pine team through her security system. Their activities had evolved from equipment preparation to what appeared to be reconnaissance of the surrounding terrain. Cahill, in particular, was methodically documenting approach routes and cover positions around the cabin's perimeter, though remaining outside the direct view of Catherine's windows. "He's mapping our defensive position," Morales observed, studying Cahill's movements through the security feed. "Standard procedure for tactical planning. Identify observation points, fields of fire, potential blind spots. He's also likely considering Rangers' patrol capabilities," Catherine added. His background with military working dogs means he understands canine asset deployment, including typical patterns and limitations. This specialized knowledge made Cahill particularly dangerous, while Garrett provided direct action capability and Thornton's strategic direction. Cahill's understanding of working dog protocols could potentially neutralize one of Catherine's primary advantages if properly applied. By late afternoon, approximately 4:30 p.m., the storm had fully passed Hollow Creek Valley, leaving behind saturated ground and intermittent cloud cover that diffused the westering sunlight. Darkness would arrive within hours, fundamentally altering the tactical environment surrounding the cabin. Morales received an update from Sheriff Thompson via radio. FBI agents remained delayed by storm damage to transportation infrastructure, their estimated arrival now pushed to late evening at the earliest. The news confirmed what Catherine had already calculated. The critical phase of this confrontation would occur before external reinforcements could arrive. Sheriffs attempting to coordinate with state police for helicopter support, Morales reported after the radio communication, but their assets are prioritized for flood evacuation operations in the western counties. We should operate under the assumption that we're on our own until at least 2200 hours. Catherine nodded, having expected this reality. Rural law enforcement rarely had sufficient resources for rapid response to remote locations, particularly during widespread weather emergencies. The situation would be resolved one way or another under the cover of approaching darkness. "They're moving again," she noted, attention drawn to the security feed where Thornton's team had finished their reconnaissance and equipment preparation. Rather than approaching directly, they appeared to be establishing multiple positions around the property perimeter, a tactical deployment that suggested coordinated operations rather than direct assault. Setting up containment positions, Morales assessed with professional concern. Standard procedure for site security operations. Establish perimeter control before addressing the primary objective. The deputy's analysis aligned with Catherine's own tactical understanding. Thornton was applying professional methodology to the situation, treating the property as an objective to be secured through coordinated action rather than individual confrontation. Despite the earlier setback, their approach remained calculated and disciplined. "We need to disrupt their operational tempo," Catherine stated, formulating an adaptive response to this development. "Allow them to establish their positions, then demonstrate capability beyond what they're anticipating. Force them to continually reassess rather than execute their planned approach." Morales considered this strategy with professional assessment. Psychological operations component. "Create uncertainty about our defensive capabilities to delay direct engagement until reinforcements arrive," she nodded with approval. "Tactically sound, especially given our numerical disadvantage." As sunset approached, casting long shadows across the clearing surrounding the cabin, Catherine finalized preparations for the night operations that now seemed inevitable. Ranger remained vigilant and ready, his specialized training allowing him to maintain operational effectiveness despite the extended alert status. The security feed showed Thornton's team had completed their perimeter positioning, with Garrett established to the north, Cahill to the southwest, and Thornton himself maintaining a command position near their vehicle. The pattern suggested a coordinated approach, designed to overwhelm Catherine's defenses through simultaneous pressure from multiple vectors. "They'll wait for full darkness before initiating," Morales predicted, checking her equipment one final time as daylight continued to fade. "Maximum advantage for their numbers and tactical equipment," Catherine agreed with the assessment. "Which means we have approximately 40 minutes to implement our counter-strategy." She turned to Ranger, who remained attentive at her side despite the hours of sustained vigilance. "Time to demonstrate why underestimating a widow and her dog was their first and most significant tactical error." As the sun dipped below the western ridge, casting Hollow Creek Valley into deepening twilight, Catherine activated specialized equipment Daniel had insisted on maintaining just in case. Capabilities beyond what conventional civilian defense would include, designed specifically for scenarios where tactical advantage needed to be established against superior numbers. Morales observed these preparations with professional appreciation, recognizing the advantages they would provide in the approaching confrontation. "They have no idea what they're actually dealing with, do they?" she commented, a grim smile touching her features as darkness began to settle over the property. "No," Catherine replied, her hand resting briefly on Ranger's head as they prepared to defend what was hers against men who had fundamentally misjudged both the widow and her dog. "But they're about to find out." Complete darkness enveloped Hollow Creek Valley as the cloud-covered night sky blocked both moonlight and stars. Catherine's cabin stood as a small island of soft yellow light in the encompassing blackness, appearing vulnerable and isolated amid the wilderness. Exactly the impression she wanted to create. "Movement at the north perimeter," Deputy Morales whispered, monitoring the night vision feed Catherine had activated after sunset. The thermal imaging showed Garrett advancing through the trees with practiced stealth, carrying what appeared to be tactical equipment in addition to concealed weapons. Cahill approaching from the southwest, Catherine confirmed, watching the second operative's progress on a separate security feed. Thornton maintains command position at the vehicle, coordinating their approach. The pattern was textbook, a professional operation leveraging numerical advantage and specialized equipment. Despite their earlier setback, Thornton's team executed with disciplined coordination that highlighted their paramilitary background. What they couldn't know was that Catherine had spent the hours of twilight implementing countermeasures far beyond conventional home security. Daniel's insistence on maintaining specialized defensive capabilities just in case now seemed almost prophetic. "Perimeter system active," she confirmed, checking the tablet that displayed multiple specialized feeds. "All sensors online," Morales nodded from her position near the front window, where she maintained visual coverage without exposing herself to observation. Her department-issued sidearm had been supplemented with the shotgun Catherine provided, loaded with less lethal rounds that would incapacitate without causing permanent injury. Sheriff's last update puts FBI assets at least 70 minutes out, Morales reported quietly. We need to hold it until then. Catherine acknowledged this with calm focus. 70 minutes was an achievable tactical objective. Delay and disrupt Thornton's approach without allowing the situation to escalate beyond their control. Her training with Daniel had emphasized precisely these scenarios: superior numbers versus superior preparation and position. Ranger had been deployed 15 minutes earlier, slipping from the cabin through his specialized access point with silent efficiency. Unlike conventional guard dogs that would remain with their handlers, Ranger's advanced training allowed independent operation while maintaining contact through the specialized equipment integrated into his tactical harness. His current mission: perimeter disruption and communications interdiction, leveraged capabilities that Thornton's team, despite Cahill's background with military working dogs, would not anticipate. Garrett's approaching the first countermeasure, Catherine observed through the security feed. Activation in 3, 2, 1. On the thermal display, Garrett's advancing figure suddenly staggered as the countermeasure activated, not a harmful device, but a specialized sound emitter broadcasting frequencies designed to create disorientation without causing permanent damage. The effect was immediate and evident even through the limited resolution of the thermal feed. He stumbled, hand moving to his ear where a tactical communication device was likely positioned. Directional audio disruption, Catherine explained to Morales, interferes with inner ear equilibrium and tactical communications without risking injury. Military-grade non-lethal countermeasures, Morales identified with raised eyebrows. Your husband left you with serious equipment. Daniel believed in appropriate preparation, Catherine replied simply, her attention remaining on the security feed. Garrett had recovered from the initial disorientation, but now moved with much greater caution, his advance slowed by awareness of potential additional countermeasures. Meanwhile, Cahill's approach from the southwest had encountered a different form of disruption. Tripwire-activated chemical markers invisible to conventional sight, but clearly visible on Catherine's thermal imaging. The specialized compound would adhere to clothing and skin for hours, making Cahill's position trackable regardless of what concealment he might employ. A soft double-click in Catherine's earpiece signaled that Ranger had reached his designated position. The sound brought a slight smile to her face. Everything was proceeding according to plan. Through her tactical communication system, Catherine activated the audio channel connected to Ranger's specialized equipment. Execute primary protocol. Target communications hub. The thermal imaging feed captured Ranger's response with remarkable clarity. The German Shepherd moving with explosive speed through the darkness, not toward Garrett or Cahill, but directly toward the command vehicle, where Thornton maintained tactical coordination of his team's approach. Unlike conventional attack dogs trained to target personnel directly, Ranger had been prepared for a more sophisticated objective, neutralizing the communications and coordination capabilities that gave Thornton's team their operational advantage. His approach utilized terrain features and vegetation for concealment, demonstrating tactical movement that military handlers would immediately recognize as specialized training. Thornton, positioned beside the vehicle as he coordinated his team, via their tactical network, remained unaware of the threat until Ranger was mere yards away, a testament to the German Shepherd's extraordinary stealth capabilities. The thermal feed captured the moment Thornton detected Ranger's approach and attempted to react. His movements reflected professional training, but lacked the specialized preparation necessary to counter a military-grade canine asset employing tactical infiltration techniques. Catherine watched as Ranger executed his primary protocol with flawless precision, not attacking Thornton directly, but targeting the communications equipment positioned on a folding table beside the vehicle. The specialized bite technique shattered the tactical coordination hub with controlled aggression, systematically destroying the equipment that linked Thornton to his field operators. Communications disruption successful, Catherine reported. To Morales, who observed with professional appreciation, Thornton's coordination capability has been neutralized. The effect manifested immediately on the perimeter feeds tracking Garrett and Cahill, both operators pausing in their advance, hands moving to their communication devices as their tactical network suddenly failed. Without Thornton's coordination, their synchronized approach disintegrated into individual actions, lacking cohesive strategy. "That's brilliant," Morales commented, recognizing the tactical significance. "Disrupts their entire operational framework without direct engagement." Through her communication system, Catherine heard Thornton's frustrated voice as he attempted to re-establish contact with his team using backup equipment. "Garrett, Cahill, communications compromised, fall back to the secondary rendezvous. And point immediately, primary approach aborted." The directive came too late. Both operators had already committed to their final approach vectors, now operating without coordination or awareness of each other's positions. This breakdown in communication created precisely the vulnerability Catherine had intended to exploit. "Deputy Morales," Catherine said calmly, "now would be the appropriate time for official law enforcement warning." Morales nodded, activating the cabin's external speaker system. Her voice carried clearly through the darkness. "This is Deputy Carmen Morales, Millerville County Sheriff's Department. You are trespassing on private property after receiving official citation. Identify yourselves and withdraw immediately or face arrest." The official warning echoed across the clearing. Garrett froze in his advance, clearly recognizing the legal complications introduced by direct law enforcement confrontation. Cahill, however, continued his approach from the southwest, either not hearing the warning or choosing to disregard its implications. "Differential response," Catherine noted. "Garrett is reassessing, but Cahill is still advancing toward the rear entry point." "I'll maintain position covering Garrett," Morales replied. "You address Cahill's approach." Catherine moved silently to the rear of the cabin, positioning herself with clear observation of Cahill's approach vector. Through her specialized audio monitoring system, she detected his movement as he reached the edge of the cabin's rear deck. The subtle compression of wood beneath careful footsteps, revealing his position with precision that normal hearing could never achieve. Rather than immediately confronting him, Catherine activated the secondary countermeasure she had prepared for this approach vector, a specialized illumination system that activated with blinding intensity, destroying night vision adaptation while temporarily disorienting anyone. Caught in its focused beam, the effect on Cahill was immediate. He recoiled physically from the sudden light assault, one arm raised to shield his eyes, while the other moved toward what was likely a concealed weapon. "Federal authorities have been dispatched to this location," Catherine stated through the cabin's rear speaker system. "Your communications have been disabled, your approach documented, and your legal situation escalates with every continued action, Mr. Cahill." Using his name directly created the psychological impact Catherine had calculated. Cahill hesitated, tactical training conflicting with the recognition that the operational parameters had fundamentally shifted against him. "This property will be secured," he responded finally, voice tight with controlled anger. "Today, tomorrow, eventually. Clearwater doesn't abandon high-value acquisitions." "Perhaps," Catherine acknowledged, "but tonight You face a choice between tactical withdrawal and criminal charges when federal agents arrive. Your employer might consider legal complications an acceptable cost. But will they cover your personal legal expenses when this escalated? Beyond property disputes, the question targeted the fundamental vulnerability in private contractor operations, the distinction between corporate objectives and personal liability when operations crossed into illegal territory. Catherine had observed similar dynamics during Daniel's contract work, noting how quickly companies distance themselves from individual operators when legal scrutiny intensified. Cahill's hesitation lengthened as he processed this reality, clearly calculating his personal risk against operational objectives. Without communications to Thornton, he lacked directive clarity about how to proceed given the altered circumstances. The decisive factor emerged unexpectedly, Ranger's secondary protocol bringing him silently into position behind Cahill. The German Shepherd's approach entirely undetected by the operator focused on the cabin's rear entrance. Mr. Cahill, as someone with military working dog experience, you should understand exactly what assets I have at my disposal, Catherine stated, calmly. The dog you attempted to taunt earlier today is currently positioned directly behind you, awaiting a single command. The effect of this revelation was visible even through the night vision feed, Cahill's posture stiffening as he processed the tactical reality that he had been outmaneuvered not only by Catherine's defensive preparations, but by the very canine asset he had professionally dismissed. "You're bluffing," he responded, though his voice lacked conviction. "Ranger, Alpha position confirm." The command triggered Ranger's acknowledgement protocol, a single distinctive bark that shattered the night silence directly behind Cahill's position, confirming both the German Shepherd's presence and his readiness to engage on command. Cahill's response was immediate and professionally rational. He slowly raised his hands away from his body, acknowledging the tactically untenable position he now occupied. "Standing down," he stated clearly, the professional operator recognizing when a situation had definitely turned against him. "Wise decision," Catherine acknowledged. "Deputy Morales will take you into custody. Any resistance will result in Ranger being deployed with considerably less restraint than he demonstrated during your colleague's earlier experience." Morales appeared at the side of the cabin, her department-issued sidearm held in a professional-ready position. "On your knees, hands behind your head," she directed with clear authority. "You're under arrest for criminal trespassing, attempted breaking and entering, and conspiracy to commit property damage." Cahill complied, tactical training apparently including sufficient legal awareness to recognize when resistance would only compound his situation. As Morales secured him with department-issued restraints, Catherine maintained vigilance through the security feeds, tracking Garrett's position and Thornton's activities near the disabled communications equipment. The feeds showed Garrett had begun tactical withdrawal toward the vehicle position, apparently recognizing the operational collapse following communications disruption and Cahill's apprehension. Thornton remained beside the vehicle, his body language communicating the frustrated calculation of someone watching a carefully planned operation disintegrate. "One in custody," Morales reported as she secured Cahill in her patrol vehicle. "Garrett appears to be retreating toward Thornton's position. How do you want to proceed?" "Maintain containment rather than pursuit," Catherine decided. FBI assets are now less than 40 minutes out, according to Thompson's last update. Documented apprehension of one Clearwater operative provides sufficient legal framework for federal intervention. Through the security feeds, Catherine observed the final disintegration of Thornton's operation, Garrett reaching the vehicle position where Thornton appeared to be engaged in urgent communication via satellite phone, likely reporting operational failure to Clearwater superiors and requesting extraction protocol. Within minutes, both men had entered their vehicle and begun navigating the logging road away from Catherine's property. Tactical withdrawal acknowledged, though unlikely to, represent strategic abandonment of Clearwater's ultimate objective. When Ranger returned through his specialized access point, Catherine acknowledged his flawless performance with quiet appreciation. "Mission successful," she murmured, briefly resting her hand on his head before returning her attention to securing the property before federal authorities arrived. Dawn broke over Hollow Creek Valley, casting long shadows across Catherine's clearing as the first FBI vehicles arrived. A tactical team, followed by investigative personnel who established a perimeter around the property with professional efficiency. Special Agent Marcus Diaz, the lead investigator who had coordinated with Sheriff Thompson throughout the developing situation, approached Catherine as she stood on her porch, with Ranger vigilant at her side. "Miss Shepherd," he greeted her with professional courtesy after the initial scene assessment. "I understand you have documentation regarding this situation." Catherine provided the comprehensive intelligence package she had compiled, including materials received through the Sentinel protocol Daniel had established before his death. Diaz reviewed these with increasing interest, occasionally conferring with colleagues as the significance became apparent. "This is exceptionally thorough," he acknowledged, looking up with newfound respect. "Most civilians wouldn't have the resources or knowledge to compile intelligence at this level. My husband ensured I would have what I needed if certain situations arose," Catherine replied simply. "Daniel believed in appropriate preparation." Understanding flickered across the agent's expression, recognition of the specialized background. That explained Catherine's extraordinary preparation and response. "Special forces tend to think that way," he commented, neither requesting confirmation nor expressing surprise at what the documentation suggested about her husband's former role. The morning unfolded with professional efficiency as federal authorities established investigation parameters. Cahill remained in federal custody. Formal statements were recorded from both Catherine and Deputy Morales, and technical teams documented the sophisticated countermeasures that had disrupted Thornton's operation. By mid-morning, preliminary federal conclusions had been reached. Sufficient evidence existed to pursue both criminal charges against individual operators and regulatory investigation into Clearwater Strategic Resources' corporate activities. The attempted use of an incendiary device, documented through Catherine's security footage, provided particular leverage for federal intervention beyond what local property disputes would normally justify. "Ms. Shepherd," Agent Diaz addressed, her as the main investigative team prepared to depart, leaving a security detail to maintain scene protection. "We'll need your continued cooperation as this investigation proceeds. But I can tell you confidentially that what you've provided creates significant legal exposure for the corporate entities involved." Catherine nodded, understanding the implications. "Will they continue to pursue acquisition of my property?" Diaz considered the question with professional assessment. "Corporations like Clearwater operate on risk-reward calculations. Federal investigation substantially alters that equation, particularly with environmental agencies now involved due to the mineral deposit aspects." He paused, then added with candid honesty, "That said, I wouldn't expect them to simply abandon interests of this financial magnitude. The approach will likely shift to legal and regulatory channels rather than direct intervention." "Understanding the threat has evolved is itself valuable," Catherine replied, appreciating the agent's straightforward assessment. "I'll maintain appropriate vigilance." As federal personnel completed their initial documentation, Sheriff Thompson arrived personally, having coordinated the multi-agency response throughout the night from his department headquarters. His weathered face reflected satisfaction at the outcome, particularly when he observed Morales's professional interaction with the federal teams. "Knew I was right to send Carmen," he commented to Catherine. Military backgrounds recognize each other, don't they? Catherine acknowledged this with a slight nod. She performed exceptionally. Her presence provided official legitimacy that significantly strengthened our position. Thompson's gaze shifted to Ranger, who maintained his vigilant posture despite the hours of sustained activity. "That's one remarkable animal," he observed quietly. "Daniel trained him personally?" "They were partners before becoming ours," Catherine replied, the simple statement conveying depths of meaning that Thompson, with his own military background, would understand without requiring elaboration. The sheriff nodded, respect evident in his expression. "Valley communities owe you more than they realize, Catherine. What Clearwater intended here would have devastated more than just your property." "Communities protect their own," she responded, recalling Walt Preston's words from the hardware store, or at least they should. 1 week later, Catherine sat on her porch watching the sunset paint Hollow Creek Valley in shades of gold and crimson. Ranger lay at her feet, alert yet relaxed. In the peaceful evening, the federal presence had been reduced to occasional check-ins as the investigation into Clearwater strategic resources proceeded through official channels. The immediate threat had passed, though Catherine maintained vigilance. Corporations, with billions at stake, rarely abandoned their objectives entirely, even when initial approaches failed. Still, the formal involvement of multiple federal agencies had fundamentally altered the landscape of the confrontation, shifting it from direct tactical engagement to legal and regulatory battlegrounds, where Catherine's documentation provided powerful leverage. A vehicle approaching along her access road drew her attention, Frank Miller's pickup truck navigating the familiar path with unhurried certainty. The elderly rancher had visited several times since the confrontation, his initial concern evolving into a neighborly routine that reflected the valley community's renewed cohesion in the face of external threat. As Miller's truck parked before her cabin, Catherine noted with interest that he wasn't alone. Walt Preston from the hardware store sat in the passenger seat, and Sheriff Thompson's patrol vehicle followed close behind. "Evening, Catherine," Miller called as he emerged from his truck, removing his weathered Stetson in greeting. "Hope we're not intruding on your peace and quiet." "Never an intrusion, Frank," she assured him, rising to greet her unexpected visitors as Ranger moved to her side. "What brings you all out this evening?" The three men exchanged glances before Thompson stepped forward. "Community business," the sheriff explained. "Word came down today from the county commission. They've officially rejected Black Pine's highway proposal following the federal investigation revelations." Preston nodded, adding with evident satisfaction, "Turns out commissioners get nervous about approving projects when federal agents start asking questions about mineral rights and corporate shell games." "That's welcome news," Catherine acknowledged, "though I doubt Clearwater has abandoned their interest entirely." "No, they haven't," Thompson confirmed, "but they're facing regulatory scrutiny on multiple fronts now. Their approach has to change, and that's given us time to implement some community protection measures." Miller cleared his throat, clearly. The designated spokesman for whatever proposition had brought them to her door. "Catherine, we've been talking. Lot of folks in the valley have, actually. What happened here? It got people thinking about what matters, and who decides the future of Hollow Creek." He gestured toward Preston and Thompson. "Walt and Jim have been meeting with property owners throughout the valley. We've formed a conservation trust, legal framework to protect the watershed and establish community oversight for any development." "In proposals," Preston stepped forward, offering Catherine a document folder. "We've drafted bylaws and filed preliminary paperwork. Over 20 property owners have already committed to participation, agreement to sustainable land management practices, and collective review of any commercial proposals." Catherine accepted the folder, recognizing the significance of what these men were describing. Not just resistance to a specific corporate threat, but the establishment of positive community governance structures to prevent similar situations. In the future, we'd like you to consider joining the trust, Thompson added. More importantly, we'd like you to serve on the governing council. Your background and specific skill set would be invaluable in helping establish appropriate protective protocols. The invitation represented something Catherine hadn't expected. Not just acknowledgement of her successful defense of personal property, but recognition of her potential contribution to broader community resilience. It offered purpose beyond individual security, a way to honor Daniel's legacy by extending protection to the entire valley he had chosen for their home. "I'll need to review the documentation," she replied, though her decision was already forming. "But I appreciate the invitation and the principle behind it." As the conversation continued into the evening, plans and possibilities unfolding with the practical focus of people accustomed to building rather than merely resisting, Catherine reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. When Thornton and his men had first appeared on her property, they had seen only what they expected to see: a vulnerable widow with a dog, isolated and defenseless against corporate pressure. Their fundamental error had not been tactical or strategic, but perceptual, failing to recognize that both the widow and the dog possessed capabilities far beyond ordinary civilian parameters. They had underestimated Catherine's resolve, dismissing her as an obstacle rather than recognizing a formidable defender prepared through years of specialized training alongside her late husband. They had taunted Ranger, seeing only a pet rather than a precisely honed tactical asset capable of disrupting professional operators with military efficiency. Most critically, they had calculated resistance in individual terms rather than recognizing the community bonds that ultimately proved stronger than corporate pressure. Miller's warning, Preston's support, Thompson's strategic deployment of Morales, all forming a network of resistance that transcended Catherine's individual defensive capabilities. As darkness settled over Hollow Creek Valley, the visitors departed with plans for a broader community meeting the following week. Catherine remained on her porch with Ranger at her side, watching the stars emerge in the clear night sky while contemplating the future that now seemed possible. Not just personal security, but community resilience against whatever threats might next emerge. Her hand rested briefly on Ranger's head, acknowledging the partnership that had proven crucial in the confrontation's most critical moments. "Good dog," she murmured, the simple phrase conveying depths of appreciation that extended far beyond conventional commands. In the end, Thornton's men had learned a costly lesson about appearances and reality, discovering too late that the isolated widow they had marked for intimidation possessed the training, resources, and determination to defend what was hers against even professional operators. The dog they had taunted, believing it merely a companion animal, had systematically dismantled their tactical operation with military precision. As Hollow Creek Valley settled into night silence, Catherine took quiet satisfaction in knowing her home remained secure, protected not by vulnerability as Thornton had perceived, but by precisely the opposite: the extraordinary capabilities of a widow who had refused to yield, and a dog trained to go for the throat when circumstances demanded. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.